Our story begins as a massive fleet emerges in deep space. Several large destroyers, capital ships, and within them, all massive armies. At the head of all these armies were Sith Lords. They didn't know where they were. All they knew was that there was something off about what had just transpired. Something was awry in the Force. It was possible that they had traveled into the future, but how? They didn't even have the proper coordinates for where they were. There were multiple Sith Lords, some of which were familiar with each other, but some of the named ones were the Triumvirate, Revan, Bastila, Malak, Malgus, Bane. They were all here. The most powerful Sith throughout the course of history were gathered through some sort of coincidence through the Force. There were high tensions between the Sith Lords, so powerful and even very hungry, a civil war could easily break out instantaneously. Though if the Sith were able to maintain their composure for more than 2 minutes, they could possibly take over the Republic. For all they knew, the Jedi were still at the helm of power in the galaxy, sitting in that temple of theirs on Coruscant, sitting idly, believing that there was nothing wrong in the galaxy. And though there was this assumption, it was true. Millions of light years away, the Jedi sat in their temple, unaware that the Sith have just arrived in deep space. Their ignorance shown 10 years before when the Sith returned and killed Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn, though it was quickly solved by the vibrant Obi-Wan Kenobi. Kenobi was now the Jedi Master to Anakin Skywalker. Grandmaster Yoda sat in the council chamber silently, as the council was having one of its common discussions. Yoda was especially focused because there was darkness covering the galaxy. It suddenly appeared from nowhere, and the darkness that had been rising ever so slowly during Yoda's life was nothing compared to the brute force that was this evil that had just arrived. Slowly, the Jedi Masters and the High Council began to take notice of the extremely dark presence in the Force, though it wasn't just the Jedi who picked up on the massive disturbance in the Force. The shock in the Force was ever so prevalent that it sent Palpatine not into bewilderment but panic. The dark side energy was so much more than he and Plagueis ever admitted, and though Palpatine knew of his plans for the Clone Wars, this wasn't that. Palpatine immediately called his apprentice via hologram, and he saw the fear in his apprentice's face. Palpatine discussed what it could have been. He knew of an ancient Sith prophecy that told of the return of the Sith's most powerful warriors. The legend was even known by Sidious's dark adversary, Mother Talzin. They both never really thought any day would come of which the Sith Empire would return, but Palpatine had two plans, and he made sure that he would relay them to his apprentice. The first plan is what Palpatine was preparing to do immediately. The second plan was if he wasn't able to succeed with the first plan. Dooku agreed to what his master was preparing to do, and so the plan was set into motion by Darth Sidious. He prepared to leave his offices on Coruscant, but before he left, he was confronted by the Jedi Masters of the High Council: Plo Koon, Yoda, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Mace Windu. Palpatine was befuddled. He was completely caught off guard by their presence as well. In fact, the return of the Sith Empire was throwing everything off balance in the galaxy. Palpatine was the one most impacted by this. Because of the Sith's return, he was no longer the dominant Force user of the dark side, and so he was facing trouble controlling the dark side so easily. It was like he was fighting for dominance in that realm. This was the first time in his life. Palpatine had always been more destined to have more power than Plagueis, and even Plagueis knew this. He wanted his apprentice to grow more powerful than him anyways, but Palpatine, being so arrogant with his power, never expected the Force to be filled with so much evil, with so much competition. When the Jedi walked in, Palpatine sat back down in his seat and asked why they were here. Of course Palpatine knew, but he had to play dumb. He was extremely bothered too, because he knew the Jedi would feel the ever so prominent darkness. Palpatine wanted to scream at them and tell them that the Sith had returned, but that was an undertaking he had to commit on his own. The meeting dragged on for some time and Palpatine was losing his patience. And while he was losing his patience, he began to lose focus on his concealment. Not all of it, but one of his eyes started to glow yellow. Though the Jedi didn't point it out. They only thought it to be awfully peculiar that the Chancellor all of a sudden was showing yellow eyes. Eyes of a Sith. They let him leave because he was urgently requesting to leave the Senate building on his personal duties, but when the group of Jedi separated and the Chancellor left aboard a shuttle, both parties knew something was awry with the other. The Jedi now believed firmly that Palpatine was possibly the Sith Lord, and the causation of this evil in the galaxy. Windu and Mundi were acting belligerent to this. They were upset that they just hadn't done anything, only for the other masters to remind them to trust in the Force. Yoda reminded the Jedi with him to be patient. The path forward would eventually reveal itself. Weeks would pass by and the darkness grew closer and closer. The Chancellor hadn't yet been seen during that time. His personal business was beginning to worry members of the Senate. Masameda reassured the Senate that all would be okay, and to continue the normal operations of the Galactic Republic. Palpatine grew ever so tired as he searched for an entire month trying to find the surge of darkness in the galaxy, and yet he still couldn't find its source. But he decided to try the Outer Rim, especially because the main producer of his droid army foundries were present out there. It wouldn't be long before he came across a massive fleet. Massive battleships, cruisers, and fighters surrounded everything. Palpatine's shuttle was then surrounded by fighters, and so he prepared himself. The Sith Empire during this time had barely kept balance between their ranks. With the egos of Sith such as Malgus and Revan, the tensions on board the command vessels were very high. When Palpatine arrived on board the ship, he exited with a robe over his head, and with a frown melting down his face. Palpatine, after all of his life preparing to overthrow the galaxy, was ready to kill the Sith legends of the past. He was greeted by acolytes who immediately picked up on the raw power of the Dark Lord, and they backed away as he continued walking towards the command bridge. He saw the ancient Sith Lords, whose statues filled the temples on Korriban and several other planets of the Sith. Palpatine was slightly in awe, but more than that, he was excited. He could control the galaxy with the Sith like this. And sure, he believed the rule of two, but seeing as Darth Bane was subservient to the several Sith Lords around, Palpatine no longer felt it necessary to follow the rule of two, or the rule of a disciple at that. The Sith Lords greeted Palpatine. It was the nicest greeting a Sith could ever give. It wasn't full of lightning or a lightsaber through the jaw. The Sith knew that Palpatine were the Sith Lord at the time. They just didn't know much else about him, other than the presence of him, and that was that of a true Sith Lord. They respected him, but it didn't mean that they'd be pushovers for him. Palpatine introduced himself as Sidious, and he told the Sith Lords that he was the sole leader of the Sith. A few of the Sith smirked, while the others crossed their arms. They had found peace, with tension, but peace aboard the ship. They were all dedicated to wiping out the Jedi, and that's what kept them together. But Palpatine's presence disrupted the balance on board the ship. Lord Sion stepped out forward and glared at Palpatine. Sidious's frown grew into an evil, sinister grin. He knew of Sion, but he also knew of the Triumvirate. If Sion attacked, Traya and the Lord of Hunger wouldn't be far behind. And so Palpatine pushed further by saying that he wanted to lead the Sith into victory against the Jedi, which then caught the attention of Revan, whose already crossed arms grew tighter. Malak and Vestila flanked him. Palpatine didn't intend on this, but if he was pissing off the entire established leadership, then why not push a little further? He was a powerful Sith. Some might even consider him the most powerful. Maybe his arrogance was getting to the best of him, but he wanted to prove his power to those of whom he used to look up to. Sidious then rang out the words of challenge. He challenged the ship's bridge for leadership, and before an epic battle could commence, Palpatine was electrocuted by Malgus, who stepped out from behind of Palpatine and was lowering the tension in the bridge. He had some acolytes place him in cuffs. Palpatine wouldn't be killed, he was too necessary for that, but they didn't want him causing any more tension within the ranks of the Sith. The Sith found their inner balance by sectioning off pieces of the galaxy to each respective Sith Lord, and yes, the ever-so-arrogant Palpatine would be gifted a share of the galaxy for his cooperation. The Sith kept Palpatine held captive on board the command deck, so that they could keep a close eye on him. At this point, the Sith were in the Outer Rim, just outside of a planet they didn't know about. It was golden orange with a large ring around it, but moments later a large fleet emerged from hyperspace. Palpatine knew what it was immediately. The Republic was invading Geonosis. Sidious told the Sith Lords that his plan was coming into action. There would be no peace in the galaxy as the Clone Wars were beginning. Though the idea to plunge the galaxy into war was creative, the Sith Lords didn't really care for this approach. It meant that they now had to fight an army to get to the Jedi, and so they disapproved of Palpatine's actions. They believed that with the army they had, they could have just easily done the job without him, or his droid army. Before the Battle of Geonosis could come to an end, as the Separatists retreated from the planet, the fleet of Lucrehulks were ambushed by the Sith Empire. The Lucrehulks were old vessels, but they packed a punch, and so they got into combat with the ancient Sith ships. But before either side could appear to have a significant advantage, a clone armada was seen approaching the battle. On board, the Jedi who had just claimed victory on Geonosis had a bigger issue. The ancient Sith appeared to have returned. The Sith fleet was the most capable fleet out of the three in this epic confrontation. Unlike the fleeing Separatists and the attacking Republic, the Sith military was established and in a perfect position to create a desolation of both fleets. And with the little tactical ability that the Jedi had, they decided to leave the combat zone. The casualties they faced on the ground were enough for one war, let alone a singular battle. As the Sith and Separatists interlocked in combat, the Separatists needed to leave the battle zone before it got worse. They were outmatched by the superior Sith Armada, and so not soon after the clones retreated, the Separatists left as well. This was the worst decision for either side, because it emboldened the Sith's morale. They now knew that there was no force in the galaxy that could stop them. The Jedi returned to Coruscant and prepared for the worst. They knew the legends. When the Sith invaded Coruscant and captured the city world from the Jedi a long time before in the ancient days of the Old Republic, they prepared for the possibility of losing to the Sith and going into hiding to allow the Sith to kill themselves off through inner fighting. Though a sound strategy for the Jedi, it was the last possible decision they could ever allow to take place in order to allow the Sith to take the rule of the galaxy from them. As for the Separatists, they still wanted to take over the Republic and kick Palpatine out of office. The Sith provided a new enemy for the droid armies, and Dooku had to fulfill his mission that was given to him by Palpatine. But since he hadn't heard from Sidious in so long, he was prepared to skew the plans into what would fit his own model of the galaxy. Though it would be increasingly difficult to side with either the Republic or the Sith, especially after the Separatists' large defeat at Geonosis. The Republic stationed the largest fleet they could outside of Coruscant, mostly clone vessels with a couple of ships that the Galactic Republic itself already had. The fleet above Coruscant would be struck at any moment, and so it was. The massive Sith fleet emerged from hyperspace. Clone warships went into action immediately. The Sith ships, though outdated, were made for combat and conquering. The Republic light frigates and carriers, like Arquentances and Acclamators, were struggling against these warships. The very few Venator-class Star Destroyers were holding their own against the fleet of Sith. As the Republic vessels began crumbling under the firestorm, Jedi starfighters were giving aid to the fleet above. Meanwhile, on the surface, Jocasta Nu and a few other Jedi escorted the younglings and Padawans off-world to a secret location. There were thousands of clones stationed in the ground and around the Jedi Temple. The Jedi needed all their best fighters to be present in this battle. The temple was filled with Jedi Masters and Knights. Anakin was in the medical bay, getting himself a replacement hand. He hadn't had the chance to marry Padme, but he promised her that they would marry after the Battle of Coruscant was over. The Venators over Coruscant were taking down Sith Imperial flagships, but the capital ship of the fleet was gone. It had vanished, and no one had any idea where it went. And while the Clone Armada was steadying its defense, after losing many of its support ships, a dark shadow cast itself across Coruscant. Before anyone could acknowledge this casted shadow, fire rang out across the city. A massive explosion covered the skies of Coruscant, blocking out the sun. The Jedi, from their steps, looked out across the city and saw the Senate building obliterated by a bombardment. Senators from all across the galaxy were dead within moments. Shuttles rained down from the sky on the Jedi Temple. Clone troopers in front of the temple began to open fire. Heavy flak began to engulf the sky. Though a few shuttles were shot down, the Sith landed at the base of the Jedi Temple. Running up to the top of the temple, acolytes and warriors engaged with the Jedi in a colossal battle that was reminiscent of the past. Clone troopers took advantage of the high ground and began shooting down on the Sith troopers and clankers as they approached the Jedi Temple. The clones were leagues superior than the Republic troopers of the Old Republic, and even more so, they were actually superior to the Sith troopers as well. Though the clone troopers were winning, the Sith warriors began to cut through the clones and the Jedi alike. The Jedi had been safe for too long. They hadn't been warriors in over millennia. Of course they were bound to fail. But within the desolate landscape that was becoming the steps of the Jedi Temple, High Council members arrived and the warriors began to fall. Master Ki-Adi-Mundi got into extreme combat. Plo Koon and Mace Windu fought side by side, cutting down warriors of the past. While the council members were causing a ruckus in the middle of the Sith advance, they mirrored a rock in a river. A few Sith fought them, and the main group of Sith were pushing into the Jedi Temple, where they met the remaining council members and Master Yoda. The remaining Masters and Knights were in here. The duo of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker were fighting back to back after their devastating loss to Count Dooku on Geonosis. The clone troopers from the walkway overseeing the entrance began to fire down, clipping several of the Sith and even more Sith troopers. The few Jedi Masters from the front steps fought their way back inside the temple. As they returned, darkness devoured the force around them. Ki-Adi-Mundi was pulled back as a clearance was made in combat. Lord Malgus held Ki-Adi-Mundi's neck in his hands as he held him down to the ground as he cut through the Jedi Master's body. He started talking about the return of the Sith and the foolishness of the Jedi. No matter, the other Sith Lords appeared in the sea of warriors. Before anyone could do anything, several respected Jedi Masters began to get executed. None as badly as Jedi Master Luminar Unduli, who was yanked by the Force and drained by the Lord of Hunger himself, and before he entirely devoured her Force essence, he broke her neck with his hands. The battle continued and the Jedi struggled. Malgus was tired of the clones creating a disadvantage for the Sith, and a swift throw of his lightsaber cut down the pillars that kept the walkway up, and it crumbled. Jedi and clones alike were crushed by the power of the pillars falling on them. Plo Koon engaged Malgus and pushed him back, while Windu took on Revan in a one-on-one combat. Yoda took on Lord Traya in fierce combat. Nihilus, Sion, and Bane went on a killing spree as Jedi tried to save one another. In a heroic move, Kenobi took a blade to the gut from Nihilus to protect his Padawan. Shakti, who was nearby, saw the act and jumped in to fend off Sion. These matches were evenly matched, but the Jedi around the temple were being slaughtered, as were the clones. Yoda told the Jedi that they needed to escape. Anakin carried his dying master away as Shakti defended him from Sion. Kit Fisto, Eth Koth, and Mace Windu all held the final line of defense for the Jedi escaping. The clones, the few who were still alive, stood behind the three Jedi holding the line, firing at the Sith. Not long after Yoda gave his order, the Jedi were escaping the temple via gunships, heading for a singular Venator-class Star Destroyer on the other side of the planet. As the three masters waited for the Grand Master, he turned and looked at them and nodded, before using all of his force might to force push the Sith across the room, into the wall, snapping backs, cracking necks. Yoda fell to the ground. As Mace tried to grab the Grand Master, he used the last little bit of force he had to push Mace back into the arms of Koth and Fisto. Malgus smiled and scoffed at the Jedi for being so pure of the heart before stabbing Yoda in the back, ending the 800-year-old life. Clones fled out in front of the last three Jedi. They were the last to leave the ship and escape into hyperspace. Much like the fleet on the other side of the planet, they were too in full retreat after losing to the Sith Armada. Both ground and space forces for both the Sith and the Republic were severely depleted. The Jedi were returning to an ancient world where the Sith wouldn't be able to think to find them. It was the location of the first Jedi Temple, a place that they would call home until the time were right. The clones that retreated with the Jedi were still warriors, and they had to fight a war. The Republic was losing ground, and the clones who survived both initial battles at Geonosis and Coruscant were battle-hardened for more than anything that would come. Whether it be clankers or the average Crimson Blade-wielding psycho, the war had just begun. Though the Sith lost a good number of troops in the Jedi Temple, it wasn't hard to recruit, even if they were evil. The Sith, though, couldn't relax. They had a new enemy, and it was the CIS. Dooku caught wind of the Battle of Coruscant, and he was ready to capitalize off of the Sith victory. The Sith fleet didn't have the numbers in space, but they had the numbers on the ground, and currently the Sith Lords were demolishing pieces of the Jedi Temple to create an opening for the Sith Temple that existed beneath it. Sidious had wanted to utilize it for the longest time, but it lay hidden under the Jedi Temple. But the Sith enacted mercy and brought Palpatine down to the surface of Coruscant into the rubble of the Jedi Temple. All by Malgus' doing, Sidious was brought down to the Jedi Temple. He grinned at Palpatine and released him from his shackles. Sidious laughed to himself. The Sith had finally won. But then he heard one of the Sith troopers tell Nihilus that an enemy fleet had arrived over the planet. Palpatine turned and saw Nihilus twist his head as he looked at Sheev, and then reached out with his hand as he began to drain the life from Palpatine, and with his other hand, by his side, he drained the life from all those who were wounded by Yoda's final act. Nihilus killed Sheev and all those who were wounded around him, and then he left the stairs of the Jedi Temple and joined his master down in the Sith Temple that lay below the Jedi Temple. A massive Separatist fleet emerged from hyperspace, guided by the massive cruiser named the Malevolence. There weren't any ships left from the Sith Empire that could stand up to that vessel. The Separatists prepared everything they had for this invasion, though it didn't matter. Most of the governmental section of Coruscant was leveled, and populations throughout the city were being massacred in a giant genocide. It was brutality of the worst nature. In the underbelly of Coruscant, the citizens fought back, but they were instantly being destroyed. In space, a massive beam came from the surface of Coruscant, cutting through the Malevolence and half of the Separatist fleet. Dooku and Grievous were instantaneously killed alongside of Asajj Ventress. The rest of the fleet began to engage the Sith fleet, while landing craft made its way to the desolate cities of Coruscant below. People were being slaughtered. Those caught between the Sith armies and the clankers were doomed. The battle waged on for weeks. It was a massive campaign for the Sith, and their endurance kept them the planet of Coruscant. The Sith, though, accomplished what they really wanted: enslavement of the population while genociding the rest of it. Coruscant was completely upended, with millions of people gone within the initial week of combat, and even more so after. The Sith were tightening their grip on Coruscant. Nihilus, who operated the weapon that crippled the Separatist invasion fleet, spent more time with some of the other Sith, making sure that this machine would be ready for the Jedi should they ever return.
Our story begins on the return to the original home of the Jedi on Jakku. This planet would be a safe place away from the Sith. While the Jedi hadn't yet figured out that it was the Sith from the past, they did know that Tython, Jeddah, and Ilum were no longer safe.
Jakku was the most remote planet in the galaxy. It sat in the far reaches of space, and it had no civilized population that interacted with the rest of the galaxy on a communicative level. The Jedi retreated from the now ruined world of Coruscant. The cities were being leveled, and the Jedi were watching as the galaxy fell into chaos. Most of the Jedi present this far in the galaxy were younglings or Padawans. The average age of the Jedi present this far out into the galaxy was 19. Lots of newly knighted Jedi with no teaching experience. There were so many losses, and the Force was thrown so far to balance that the Jedi didn't know how they could go on. Their way of life was wiped out almost within an instant. The Battle of the Jedi Temple was the greatest loss of life for the Jedi in over a millennia. The clones who served during the Battle of Coruscant realized that maybe their training hadn't prepared them for this. The Republic was spread out across the galaxy, and all the local militias in the core were being mounted up into one full assault. There was a bright side for the clone army. Their forces were all mounted up around Kamino. The original batch of 200,000 units were deployed at Coruscant, and the million more on the way were being dispersed around the Outer Rim. The clones were going to be the defense force of the galaxy, though there was a positive about the Clone Wars being put on hold. While the Separatists had lost their leadership, they already had an established army. Without the Republic government functioning, there would be no reason for the Separatists not to just try and side with the Sith Empire, right? No. Regardless, on Jakku, the last transport of Jedi arrived. Anakin Skywalker was still donning his short hair, and he came off the vessel with terror in his eyes. Not for what he encountered at the Jedi Temple. He and Obi-Wan were back to back, with each other, fighting off marauders and assassins when Anakin's lack of patience got to him. He moved too far forward and he messed up by doing so. Obi-Wan, realizing that his student was the chosen one, went out of his way to take a lightsaber for a student. He knew that Anakin would eventually become the chosen one. It was like all at once Obi-Wan knew where his destiny laid, as he threw himself between Anakin and a lightsaber. Obi-Wan had survived to make it to Jakku, and when they unloaded the transport, the sun glimmered down across the island. There were no more than 3,000 Jedi still alive. While sure, that was a lot, it wasn't the 10,000 Jedi they had more than 48 hours beforehand. Anakin carried his master out and started making his way up the steps. Everything was discombobulated at this point, and Anakin knew he had to get someone to help his master. Anakin was looking for a medical droid. They were all scoured across the island. Obi-Wan told Anakin to put him down. Anakin looked at his master and listened to him as he gently laid him down next to the view of the beautiful planet. It was at the top of a cliff overlooking the entire ocean. There were several islands across Jakku's surface. Obi-Wan looked out, and the sun lined itself across the skyline. It was almost nighttime. Obi-Wan turned back to Anakin and told him that he would become one with the Force soon. Anakin shook his head, telling his master that he would get a medical droid. Obi-Wan raised his voice slightly to tell Anakin that this was not a moment for haste action. This was a moment of solidarity. Anakin was always destined to be the chosen one. Obi-Wan told Anakin that he believed that the day would come of which he would bring balance to the Force. On that day, the galaxy would rejoice and find itself in balance. Until that moment, though, Obi-Wan told Anakin that he'd be tested unlike any Jedi ever before had been tested. Anakin nodded his head. Obi-Wan then told Anakin that he was very proud of him. Anakin shook tears away from his face as he held Obi-Wan's hand. Obi-Wan told Anakin that he just asked if he could do one thing for him. Anakin responded, telling him that he would do anything. Obi-Wan pulled from his belt a small necklace with a silicax oxalate gem on it. Anakin asked what it was, as Obi-Wan told him it was a gift from the Duchess of Mandalore. Obi-Wan, with his final breath, told his student to give it back to his one true love. Anakin held the necklace in Obi-Wan's hand as his master's hand fell limp back down to the grass of the island. Anakin pushed his tears back inside of him as he held his master in his lap, trying to grasp what had just happened. A few of the council members were in the area, but only one came to Skywalker's side. Anakin sat down, quiet, heavy under his breath, broken under the words and the weight that his master had just passed on to him. Just as the same were the words that the weight of what Qui-Gon Jinn passed down to Obi-Wan. Anakin now understood the weight of being the Jedi's chosen one. It became more reality than myth could ever make it out to be. Anakin felt a heavy hand fall on his shoulder. Anakin's eyes twirled around to see 4 fingers, and followed the hand up to the presence of Plo Koon. Anakin looked up and then looked back down to Obi-Wan. He was gone. What could Anakin do? Plo knelt down next to Anakin, as if he could read the mind of the Chosen One. He told Anakin that good Jedi would die and be forgotten, but great Jedi would die and never be forgotten by the image of which their final student represented. Anakin turned back and looked at Plo. Anakin had no words. He sat somber, filled with melancholy. Plo told Anakin that time would heal these wounds, though until that time, this planet and those on it would always be a peaceful guide for him when he needed it. Anakin looked back at Obi-Wan and felt tears leave his eyes. On the top of the island, a couple of the surviving Jedi Council members stood talking. The Council members were discussing the direction of which they could go. Master Obi-Wan suggested that Mace Windu move from Master of the Order into the role of Grand Master. While Windu wasn't opposed to this, typically the eldest member of the Council would become Grand Master, and so Windu suggested they make Plo Koon the Grand Master, because with the death of Yoda, Plo Koon was the eldest member of the Jedi Order, being 383 years old. When Plo Koon reconvened, Mace told him about becoming Grand Master, to which Master Plo would deny it, telling him that while he would accept the responsibility with great care, he believed there were more pressing matters than the hierarchy of the Jedi Order. Plo Koon admitted that while he didn't care who the next Grand Master or Master of the Order became, he did care about how the Jedi would handle taking care of 3,000 Jedi on this small island. Or, as the Jedi referred to it, the Temple Island. Mace stood a little awkwardly. While Plo wasn't calling him out, it essentially was a call-out, telling him to get a grip on the actual importance of their situation at hand. Plo suggested moving away from the topic of rankings within the Jedi Order to separate the divisions. Jocasta Nu walked up to the top of the island, where they were, and gave them a head count. 2,000 of the 3,000 Jedi were either Padawans who lost their masters or simply younglings. Mace was troubled by this, as Opa Rancis asked Jocasta Nu where she believed the children should go. She told them that the Temple Island, the current island that everyone was on, should become the main command post for the Jedi and clone operations. Across the way there was an island called the Garden Island. On it were the training grounds and even more space for the students to stay on. After all, with the amount of teachers needed, what would likely happen is the Jedi would have to replace what was lost, leaving the Jedi with around 500 active members who could participate on the battlefront. Plo spoke up over Mace and suggested that they should relocate the children so that they had time to be away from the stress of the current predicament. It would also allow them to have healing time. Plo also told Jocasta Nu to bring Skywalker with her. Jocasta looked over her shoulder and down the hill a bit to see Anakin still hunched over his master. She turned to Master Plo and nodded her head. Mace, Oppo, and Plo continued talking about strategy, being that they needed to delineate where the Jedi would be best fit. Master Shaak Ti was one of the Jedi up for discussion, as it would likely be best for her to head towards Kamino and be the main general on standby on the planet. The council members remaining were also trying to figure out how they would use their troops and where they could produce more battleships. Some of the top-ranking clone commanders by this point began discussing strategy moving forward. It was a tense situation. Of course, the gravity of what had happened in the galaxy was prevalent on the minds of those gathered, but there was tension because other than the failure of the Battle of Coruscant, the clone troopers had no interactions with the Jedi. Before the younglings were relocated, Jocasta Nu, Plo Koon, and Anakin Skywalker laid to rest the body of Obi-Wan Kenobi. They wrapped him up in garments, and they lifted him with the Force and set him down into the oceans below. The crushing waves and the fury of the oceans of Batuu carried the body of Obi-Wan Kenobi into the depths, as his final resting place being here, at the original home of the Jedi. Anakin would remain silent, looking over the edge, with pain in his heart and the wind blowing across his face. Skywalker knew it was the end of his master. It was real, and he had to come to terms with it. Someone Anakin considered to be a father, and while Obi-Wan may have considered Anakin a brother, the two were the same in some respect, and the love shared between the two of them equal. Jocasta Nu, after loading the final transport of younglings, would bring Anakin away from the edge and take him with her and Master Sera Sanube over to the Garden Island, where they could try and begin to make things right. It was only a matter of time until they could actually turn everything around for themselves. The Garden Island may have been more somber than the Temple Island. While on the Temple Island there were only Masters and Knights, it held less sadness than the Garden Island. Here were the children of the Force, and the children who watched their home crumble. They had no ability to understand how or why. All they knew is what was. And what was that their home was gone. And for them, their friends had died. And even more so for them, their masters had perished in an attempt to protect them from the Sith. Anakin was very quiet when he arrived. He walked around and avoided the younglings and Padawans as he made his way for the uppermost part of the island. He found a rock and sat down on it. Anakin looked out across the horizon. It was dark. He couldn't see much, but he could hear the sound of crashing of waves. The Porgs were all quiet, but he couldn't see them either. Anakin thought to himself, reflecting upon everything that had happened. Anakin was one of a couple hundred Jedi Knights that survived, though Anakin was the only one who was away from everyone. Since it was nighttime, most of the Padawans were being put to sleep on the hard, cold, wet ground, while the Knights, at the least the ones who were still awake, took care of those who couldn't sleep. Most of the reason anyone was sleeping was because of pure exhaustion. The trauma of the past 48 hours could keep anyone awake for a fortnight, but that wasn't the case here. On the Temple Island, it was the case. Most of the Masters and Knights over there were awake. But here, Anakin was silently sitting on his pouch, assuming no one had noticed his disappearance. Though while he was sitting here, he heard the voice call out to him. It was as soft as a siren, and it sent a chill down his spine, mostly because he hadn't expected anyone to notice him while he sat alone. He assumed he went unnoticed, and yet, that was far from the truth. Anakin turned his head to see a woman with silky blonde hair and amber eyes. They met eyes, and then Anakin turned away his attention. She asked what he was doing up here, all alone, to which Anakin told her he was thinking. She knew him very well, everyone did. He was the chosen one, so he needed no introduction. But her, on the other hand, she was just one of 10,000, now only one of 3,000 remaining. She told Anakin it made sense why he came up here, to where they were. It was quiet and serene, almost like the garden inside the Jedi Temple. Anakin nodded his head. She continued, introducing herself as Natabre. Anakin asked if that was her only name. She could tell he wasn't very interested in seeing a chance for a brighter future, but she responded telling him her full name, Natabre Morden. Anakin gave a sly, nice to meet you before looking back into the abyss. She commented, suggesting that as a chosen one, maybe he should try and see the light in the situation. Anakin snapped, turning around and blasting her, exclaiming that he lost his master and he felt like the pressure of the entire galaxy was riding on his back. Natabre looked at him, shocked at first, but then her eyebrows creased. She didn't like the tone of which Skywalker had. She responded heavily, using her silky voice to convey a message that only Anakin didn't want to hear, explaining that she too lost her master. A lot of Jedi did, but they weren't hiding out here in cowardice. The entire Jedi Order felt the pressure he felt. He might be the chosen one, but this fight was everyone's, not just his. He would amount to nothing if he believed he could step in front of the entire Sith Empire wielding his lightsaber and assume that he could take them all on by himself. She continued, the path of a Jedi is righteous and patience, not found in cowardice nor pride. That's why it wasn't easy. Her fiery tone dropped down as she apologized for disturbing the Chosen One's alone time on his throne of shame, whipping herself back and walking down from his little pouch. Natabre bit her lip as she walked down. She was holding back tears. The thought of her master dying still haunted her in the forefront of her mind. She could still see him crying out to her, telling her to never look back. Natabre was the same age as Anakin. They could have been in the same classes inside the Jedi Temple because of their age group, but they weren't. Natabre felt sincerely bad about how she responded. She knew it wasn't the Jedi way to respond with such overarching rage. She was ashamed in herself. She acted out of line for a Jedi, and her master would have been disappointed in her. Natabre turned around and looked at the pouch. Anakin hadn't moved. She turned back around and walked into the darkness. She looked for a place to call her own, and when she did, she reverted into meditation. Natabre, by all means, was a Jedi at heart. She was raised as a Jedi, and she was trained to be emotionless in every aspect of life. Yet at her weakest, she only proved herself how much she needed to learn to be a Jedi true at heart. And at that, how much Anakin needed to change if he were truly meant to fulfill the prophecy. It had been a long 48 hours, and Natabre realized that she could give it a rest. It was time that she meditate and get some sleep. The morning would roll by sooner than anyone would have expected, and the effects of the last 2 days would become real. No longer were the Jedi inside the temple. They were now on 2 separate islands on the most unfindable planet in the galaxy. The announcement would be made to the Jedi that former Master of the Order, Mace Windu, would be made into Grand Master of the Jedi Order. The majority of rightly aged Jedi would be confused as to why Windu became the Grand Master over Master Plo Koon, considering the age difference, but they were never given any answers as to why. Most of the Jedi didn't assume to have an issue with this, but Anakin Skywalker did. He felt that Windu would put him into a bad place. It was Windu that didn't want him to become a Jedi to begin with. Anakin felt fear, like a cornered animal, and so because of that fear, his mind ran rampant. Yoda, while never exactly vocal about his fondness of Skywalker, made Anakin feel as if he could survive as a Jedi. But Mace Windu was a different story. If the Grand Master had been Plo Koon, he wouldn't feel the same about it. Anakin decided that he didn't want to leave the Garden Island, knowing that he wouldn't be able to hold his composure with himself. He knew that interacting with Mace would bring up a new confrontation. Though, even if Anakin wanted to go to the other island, he wouldn't be able to. There were specific transports used to get them from island to island. The reason for that being to ensure that the younglings and Padawans stayed put. Tragically, if they didn't want to stay put, it would result into them diving off the island into their death at the bottom of the Ahch-To seas. That didn't happen yet, and yet no one would assume to think it could happen. There was also a notion during the message that was played for all the Jedi that the core had gone silent. What had happened to the core was unknown, but the last reports that the clones had were nothing. Windu exclaimed that if there were any sort of resurgence of communication from the core, they would make sure to tell them. Windu's final message to the Jedi would be that the Jedi stationed on the Garden Island were meant to become teachers and help raise the next generation of students in the Jedi Order. Their roles had been defined. There was no leaving Ahch-To if the Jedi were stationed on the Garden Island. On the other hand, if the Jedi were on the Temple Island, then they would be joining the clones on the front lines. Anakin listened to the message until the transmission cut off. Anakin grew angrier and angrier in this moment. He looked across the crowd and saw Natabre, who was looking at the message until she closed her eyes momentarily. She could feel Anakin's eyes on her, and she turned around and opened them to see Anakin. He looked at her, blinked, and then walked into the midst of the crowd. Part of her wanted to follow Anakin, but she knew it was a bad idea. He was someone else's problem. She knew that if she instigated something, he'd likely lose his mind. All things considered, she could feel how unstable he was, even from this distance. Though it was that instability that made her want to talk to Skywalker. She was afraid of doing something negative though, but if she trusted that if he were the chosen one, the right series of events would play out. Just as she thought that, she saw Jocasta Nu and began talking to her about what responsibilities she would have. Jocasta Nu told Natabre that each Jedi Knight would be taking in 2 to 4 students at a time. Master Jocasta admitted that there were things that Mace left out in his speech that they had all previously talked about. Master Jocasta Nu was under the assumption that while yes, every Jedi Knight on Garden Island would be responsible in partaking in the teaching and training process for the younger Jedi, she was also under the same assumption that all the Jedi on the Garden Island would be able to help those around the galaxy on the front lines. Master Jocasta would have never put Skywalker here and the handful of other talented Jedi on this island if that were the case. She had discussed it with Mace Windu before moving Skywalker here, and now she felt like she'd failed to tell the truth. The first thing Jocasta Nu was doing was searching for Anakin. She wanted to talk to him and calm him down before he started something that he couldn't undo. She looked around, searching and searching. Natabre noticed that Jocasta Nu was looking for someone, but she wasn't sure who she was looking for. Natabre noticed the black robes of Skywalker climb up the side of the mountain towards where his poach was. Then she saw him continue his ascent. Anakin reached a point on the island and sat down. 100 thoughts ran through his mind, but the most prevalent thought on his mind being restricted. Being forced to teach Jedi, having to do something he wasn't even cleared to do. He hadn't even officially passed his trials. The Battle of Coruscant happened before he legitimately became a Jedi Knight. What could he do for anyone else? It was a mirror to Anakin as it was to Obi-Wan, having to accept responsibilities far beyond his own capabilities. Though the difference is that in such a situation, Obi-Wan took a hold of the reins and took the responsibility of training a boy who had no formal experience as a Jedi. Anakin was running away from the responsibility of teaching Jedi. That would be much easier for him to train because of their obedience. Anakin looked out across the seas. Something else sat on his mind. That was the death of a woman he loved. While he had been focused on his master's death, the death of Padme Amidala reigned in his mind as well. She died when the Sith bombed the Senate building of Coruscant. Anakin kicked the stones from the top of the mountain as they crashed down, clicking and clacking their way to the sea below. Anakin heard a soft voice and turned around, snapping his head to see Jocasta Nu. Anakin thought it was Natabre, back for round 2, but instead, it was a Jedi Master, the Archivist to be more specific. Jocasta Nu knew that Skywalker would take everything heavily, and she wanted to try and comfort him, to let him know that she was on his side. She knew that Anakin was a loose cannon, and trying to keep him restricted would only force him to rebel. She knew that wasn't necessary, though the thoughts on Anakin's mind drifted much further than rebellion. They went to a much darker place. It could be a place to take Anakin away from the Jedi, and force him elsewhere. Anakin stayed silent as Jocasta Nu talked to him, telling him all the things he wanted to hear. And while she planned on keeping promises she made to him, Skywalker didn't really want to hear that, because it's truthfully something he didn't, in the slightest believe to be true. He assumed that it was all a misconception, a lie, a way to keep him grounded. Skywalker knew that the best way forward would be to confront the Grand Master himself. Anakin was the chosen one. He couldn't just be kept here while those who ripped away all he loved from him ran rampant through the galaxy. Anakin wanted revenge, and revenge was not the Jedi way. Mace knew that Anakin would seek revenge, which is why he made efforts to keep Skywalker grounded, though that would only backfire because moments after Jocasta Nu left Anakin alone, he got himself a speeder and made his way across the waters to the Temple Island, where he would confront Mace Windu. Our episode begins in the center of the galaxy. Coruscant had been overturned in less than 48 hours. Before, it was the center of the Republic. The Senate was here, the Chancellor was here, the Jedi were here, and now they were all gone. The Sith Empire struck at the Battle of Geonosis, and then they returned to Coruscant, and they didn't stop. Of course, Coruscant was massive. There were 3 trillion beings that lived on the planet, and there were so many beings that were still alive, but many had been slaughtered. The Sith Empire was beginning to swarm the streets, execute the weak, and enslave the rest. The planet was going to become their first leg in conquering the galaxy. The swift strike made by the Sith Empire put the Separatists out of contention for power via the destruction of the Malevolence and the massive Separatist fleet supporting it. Not to mention the crippling loss of their leadership in General Grievous, Count Dooku, Asajj Ventress, and of course the mind behind all of it, Darth Sidious at the hands of the Sith. The Sith Lord of the era believed he could simply make friends with the Sith of the past and work his way into taking control, and that was far from the case. Though the bigger issue for the Sith at the moment was how they could handle their power structure. They were Sith after all, and being the fact that they were all Sith meant that they would simply try and vie for power between themselves. It was a simple recipe for absolute failure in the light of their greatest victory. The lines of the battlefront hadn't yet been drawn, and the Sith, after having claimed victory over the center of the galaxy, looked to expand their reach. There were many planets that could be very easily used for their growth, but there were also many planets that could become very troublesome for them in the future. The truth is, the Sith had no clue where the majority of the Republic forces went, especially those that belonged to the Jedi. Of course, the core was filled to the brim with militia forces, and the truth is, the core was mounting up a counter-assault. Though the downsides of a loss here for the core would be nothing short of catastrophic, because the ships that were being mounted up weren't even Republic military-grade vessels. The largest ship in their combined fleet was a handful of Acclamator-class destroyers. These vessels were only meant to be troop carriers. The truth is the core could use them on the battlefront because they were fine support ships, especially if paired correctly with a ship of the line, like a Venator, but they were the ship of the line because of the circumstance, and that wasn't really too good. The Sith stood atop the ashes of the Jedi Temple, stumbling over the dead bodies of some of the most influential Jedi of this period. Some of the Sith started connecting the dots. At this point, they hadn't really gotten around to noticing that they were serving with Sith from the past and the present. For Sith in the middle, there were names that they were very familiar with, such as Revan and Melek, or never having heard of Vitiate, or simply never having heard of the ever-elusive Darth Bane. Darth Bane was the last in a line of Sith who ruled over an empire. The Sith Triumvirate was very well known, and Traya had to keep a tight leash on her students. Nihilus was ready to feast, and Sion was 5 seconds away from losing his mind every 2 seconds because, well, he's a psycho. The issue was the Sith Masters, and the reason being is after the Jedi were slaughtered, the only challenge to their individual rise to power was each other. Immediately, Malgus, Vitiate, Traya, and Revan, to name a few, got in each other's faces about who would take control. The truth is, this conversation didn't take too long to get very heated. Malgus had a very short temper as an individual, while Darth Traya was about to release her ace in the hole, that being Nihilus. The Sith stood on the edge as a Sith emerged from the shadows, demanding the Sith to simmer down. His name was Darth Bane, and as far as any of the Sith were concerned, he was a marauder. Darth Bane, while being the Sith to establish the rule of 2, was the last in the line of Sith Lords that led armies into the battlefront. Darth Bane created the rule of 2 because he watched the Sith Order be destroyed, and he believed the best path to longevity for the Sith was the rule of 2. Considering the Sith had survived for nearly 900 years after his death, it seemed to work pretty well in his favor. Bane stood before the Sith he knew so much about. Before he could speak, Malgus ignited his lightsaber, demanding to know who he was and why he dare speak to any of them. Bane didn't flinch. He looked at Malgus and told him that he wasn't afraid. He was here to ensure that they didn't fail. This obviously wasn't the right choice of words because Cyan from the other corner of the room ignited his lightsaber and lunged forward before his master waved her hand in front of him. Darth Bane told the collective Sith that he was the sole survivor of a terrible battle that ended the legacy of the Sith Empire. He ensured the longevity of the Sith by creating the Rule of Two. Malak had enough of this, and he wrapped his arm around Bane's neck, igniting his lightsaber, holding it next to Bane's head. Revan told Malak to knock it off. He was curious in what Bane had to say. Bane shoved Malak back and expressed that if all of them wanted to be masters of the Sith Order, then they needed to collaborate. They would all fail their mandate to rule the galaxy if they fought with each other. Malgus sheathed his lightsaber as he looked over at the other Sith. Truthfully, Malgus believed he should be the rightful leader of the Sith, but he saw reason with this line of thought. Darth Bane continued telling the Sith that it would be best for them to collaboratively take over the galaxy and then divide the galaxy up for each other, in which the Sith would assume complete control over their sector of the galaxy, while also having no real reason to compete with each other. The downside to this, though, is that after they assumed control over the galaxy, what would happen? Of course, Bane hadn't gotten around to that yet, because at the moment the most important thing to do was ensure that the Sith didn't eat each other alive. It would best be sustainable as an idea for the time being, considering that most of the Sith present seemed to be on board with it. While there was a lower level Sith like assassins and marauders with their own opinions, no one really cared about what the grunts had to say regarding the strategy. It was decided that the different Sith Lords would scour the galaxy and start taking it over. As the Lords discussed strategy, one of the marauders brought forward a map of the galaxy. Not much had been really changed. For some of the Sith, there were new planets and new sectors of the galaxy that had come to life. Their intergalactic playground of terror got larger, and all they had to do was accidentally end up in the future. The map was spread out. Revan, for the few of those around before him, was the master strategist of his time. He would be able to concoct a plan and turn the tides in the favor of the Sith, as if they weren't already in majority of favor. Moments in the analyzing of the strategy, a communication came down from Vaylin, Lord Vitiate's daughter, as she informed the Sith that there was a Republic force present. The unified core worlds mounted up an assault. All the core worlds other than Biss, Corellia, and Kuat, the three planets that were a part of a deep core coalition, decided against sending their troops because they realized that the most important offense in this situation was actual defense. Over Coruscant, in between the debris of thousands of vessels, both Republic, Separatist, and Sith, a new battle was waged. The Sith fleet was essentially decimated at this point. They had fought the Separatists head-on during the initial battle of Coruscant, and scrapped their way out of the situation by using a weapon inside of the ancient Sith temple located beneath the former Jedi temple. The militia fleets that arrived over Coruscant were weak. Sure, they weren't as weak as the Sith fleet, but the ship of the line was an acclimator, and even the basic Sith warship had enough weaponry to make damage of that support ship and the acclimator itself. The battle jumped into chaos, but the truth is the core world militias weren't exactly great at fighting. They were simply safe jobs for people of each of the respective planets, because there was no conflict in the galaxy, and there was no need for real war, and so their training wasn't exactly critical to their jobs. When they were deployed for combat, they entered combat with a force that had spent decades preparing for war. Of course, it had been centuries since the armies of the past had been here, but for them, the transition from past to present felt like seconds. All their training and hard work that they did in the past carried over, and they were fighting a society that hadn't seen a real war since the time before the era of the High Republic. This army of militiamen were too weak for their own good, and within the first 2 hours of combat, their fleet was beginning to crumble. The only thing is, it wasn't crumbling because of the Sith weaponry on the ground. It was actually because of the strategy implemented by Lord Revan. Nihilus would have wanted to use the Sith Temple, but the truth is, the biggest vessel in the Republic militia fleet was too small for the super weapon to be able to hit from the ground, so the entire battle had to be decided through superior strategy, which is something that Lord Revan was able to implement into the troops as the battle began. For Revan, this was a perfect power play, especially against the egotistical minds of the Sith Lords that followed him. It was enough to remind them of why he was so good at what he did, though it would still make the other Sith Lords see him as a threat to their greater power. The Republic militia fleet would have a single vessel return to their home worlds, and so from there, Revan would spend time forcing their laborers of the Sith and newly formed slave population from Coruscant to work on rebuilding the destroyed and damaged vessels of the Sith. While at the same time, the Sith would begin to disperse. Some of the Sith would take single vessels, some of the Sith would take an invasion fleet, and others would simply take a transport of ships by themselves with a couple of troops. but it was enough to spread out rapidly across the galaxy. Darth Bane and Lord Revan stayed present on Coruscant because they were the two Sith Lords from different eras that could actually see eye to eye with each other at the moment without trying to kill each other every 2 seconds. Darth Malak went into leading a small invasion force down onto Korlog and wiping the floor with the local population, while at the same time conquering a new Sith world for the Sith. The Sith Triumvirate, featuring Darth Traya, Sion, and Nihilus, would strike directly at north of Coruscant and swoop down onto a Naxos like the Angels of Death they were. They wouldn't travel with an army, they would simply go by themselves and wreak carnage across the entire planet by themselves. Lord Vitiate would send his Children of Death to Bilbringi, while he led an invasion force to Dalia. Arkan, Thexan, and Valen would all work together as siblings to bring a downfall to the people of Bilbringi, while their father's army made short work of any defenses over Dalia. The path to Bilbringi and Dalia would be set in motion by Lord Malgus, who would recreate his infamous invasion of Alderaan, except this time he wouldn't struggle. He would swoop in and destroy everything in his path. The only Sith to fail in their attempts to reach outwards would be the ancient Sith Lord, Exar Kun, who lost the majority of his forces in an attack on Biss. It was a brilliant defense made by the trio of the core, those being Biss, Corellia, and Kuat. The 3 planets now knew the importance of their infrastructure for any real military space force, and so they kept themselves defended. It worked brilliantly because in the days after the successful Battle of Biss, all the planets in the core surrounding the 3 planets would be taken over by the Sith without any struggle, some of them being Halmora, Avarlim, Bestine, Nemodia, and Abrogada Ray. These planets would be torn to pieces, and while yes, the stance of the Sith was absolute chaos, they began to slow down how much damage they did per invasion, because while their lust for victory was overbearing, their inability to capitalize off of global populations began to cost them. If the Sith could conquer planets, they could either have willing forces to fight for them, or they could have slave labor, and either of which was good for the better cause of themselves, and it was much better than just simply burning a planet to the ground and killing everyone. So shortly after the scourge of the deep core, the planets of the core and the northern expanded regions would quickly be taken over by the Sith. Populations of each of these respective areas would be forced to obey the rule of the Sith, and as the Sith began to expand further out into this direction, the better the communication between Sith Lords became. While there were those, even marauders and assassins, who went out of their way to do their own things, there were Sith Lords who began to jolt away from the status quo. They began to see opportunity in the air, especially as the Sith controlled everything in the northern half of the galaxy, within a month and a half of the Battle of Coruscant. Exar Kun was one of the notable Sith who started to move within the ranks of the Sith. Of course, he was one of the older, more recognizable Sith in the Sith Empire, but he felt embarrassed by his defeat over Biss. While no other Sith could break through Biss, Corellia, or Kuat, he felt as if all eyes were on him, because he was one of the original reason every other Sith had to try and take the fight to the Jedi, because he was one of the original failures. Sure, that was a pessimistic way to look at the loss of Biss, but his inability to capitalize and find victory against the Republic in his age, it didn't really make a difference for him. Exar Kun was an odd man out because he was finding it difficult to find some appreciation from the other Sith Lords from within the ranks of the Sith Empire. This was also because the other Sith had been so victorious in their campaigns in the northern expanded regions. All these new territories for the Sith were perfectly placed so that they could have field day without interference from the Jedi. Well, the month after the Battle of Coruscant saw a horrific loss for the Republic and the galaxy, the Jedi and the clones were making strategy of the territory they had at their disposal. The difficulties for the Republic were dealing with the Separatists, because at the moment the Separatists weren't exactly interested in forming bonds with the Republic. Most of it was out of arrogance of the respective Separatist leaders, who didn't fall under the central authority, and other part of it was the fact of the amount of droids the Separatists had at their disposal. Because the truth is, the Separatists assumed that the Sith would just do their job for them, and then they can unite forces with them. Sure, they destroyed the Malevolence at the Battle of Coruscant, but the battle was hectic, so they gave them a pass. The Republic was there too, and it was a very tense moment for all sides. This was the only reason the Separatists assumed they could just side with the Sith. That was until they started losing their own territory across the galactic map to the Sith. Because even though the Separatists had droid armies, they were facing down armies of extremely well-trained soldiers, being led by warriors that held lightsabers that were trained to be warriors for the Sith. This wasn't trying to fight the Jedi who held peace for over a millennia. No, this was fighting a formidable force that was growing stronger by the day. There were new recruits to the lines of the Sith. Their slave labor was paying off at the shipyards around Coruscant, and they were outfitting their fleets with age-appropriate gear. All the while, the Separatists decided that it would be a better idea to sit back and watch. The Separatists were the victim of their own ignorance, and that would cost them, as the Sith Empire began slowly to encroach on their territory in the Mid-Rim. This was where the Sith Empire's success began to slow down. Their success was still top-notch, they just ran into a mass amount of droids, which began massive campaigns and elongated sieges that would take superior strategy over superior numbers to come out victorious on. The Republic, on the other hand, decided to fall back and call itself a little perimeter in the Outer Rim. With Kuat, Corellia, and Biss still operational, there was a solid chance for redemption for the Republic, especially in terms of holding their own in the most important front of any battle, the space combat. The Republic forces also added an additional cloning facility, though this wasn't at the request of the Republic, rather it was a safe move made by Lama Su, the Prime Minister of Kamino. The Kaminoans had multiple facilities a while back, and they had abandoned them for cost effectiveness, but considering the life and death of the galaxy were on the line, they might as well get to work on creating new clones. Though the one thing is that these clones would be much more expendable than any other legion of clone already created. The reason being is that these clones would have hyper-focused age acceleration, so when the Kaminoans arrived at their former colony on the world Boravio, they would begin the cloning process with a sample of the Jango-fed Geno, and the acceleration was enhanced at 10 years to every 1 year. So on the bright side, if the Republic survived for 2 years, they'd have a new batch of clones in 2 years. On the downside, those clones, if they survived, wouldn't last more than 4 years of serving the military. Though there was one important detail about this batch of clones. They wouldn't have inhibitor chips, because the inhibitor chip required them time to naturally develop inside of the brain. And because these clones would age 20 years in 2 years, the brains wouldn't be able to accept the inhibitor chip without destroying the brain in the process. The only issue was delegating the rest of the clones based in Poca City on how they wanted them to be grown, whether it be super acceleration or traditional doubled acceleration. Lama Su and Nala Se were in intense debate about this, but the truth is, the hardest part about setting all of it up were the supply lines across the galaxy. Most of the supplies came from other planets, and with half of those planets being taken over, the Kaminoans needed a means to which they could get materials to supply their armies. See, it wasn't the gear itself. The aerosmiths on Kamino built the armor and designed all the armor for Generation 1 clones. The issue with the other clones is that their hyper-accelerated growth would cause more defects to come out of the cloning process, but it was a risk they needed to make, and that was made abundantly clear to them by Grandmaster Mace Windu. The Mace and the Republic realized they had a perfect little perimeter to which they could be protected. It was set up immediately upon their arrival to Ahch-To, and it was meant to ensure the longevity of the Republic and of the Jedi. Though the Jedi made an extreme effort to hide Ahch-To from the rest of the galaxy, only top clone troopers knew about it and its location. But with the Sith ramping up their scourge of the galaxy, Mace Windu began dispatching Jedi to different frontline worlds to try and hold any positions possible. The Separatists were the larger threat in the Outer Rim and in the Mid-Rim though, surprisingly. Because without Dooku or Palpatine, the Separatists were using their full arsenal to its full capabilities. Every single droid foundry was pumping out battle droids and sending them to the front lines. Every single droid shipyard was releasing more support ships and ships of the line to the front lines so that every defense fleet could be as powerful as the next. Coincidentally, the Separatists were boxing the Republic into a smaller region of the Mid-Rim, which meant that the Separatists were taking a lot of the early war losses because they were on the frontline worlds. Of course, it was perfectly fine because with the Separatists and the amount of forces they could pump out, thanks to Geonosis and the other critical worlds like Hypori, they were releasing millions of droids monthly, and that wouldn't really be a problem for them. Though on a side note, this meant that the Separatists were beginning to see an ability to crash down hard on the Republic, because the Republic was weak, though the only reason they didn't was because of the leader military of operations, Admiral Trench. While yes, Trench saw the Republic as a threat, he realized the importance of utilizing the Republic until they were no longer needed, which for Trench meant he used all of his outlining worlds between the Sith Empire and the Republic as neutral sites. Yes, there were fleets present, but nothing large enough that would cost the Separatists that much. Admiral Trench was leaving these places weak so that the Sith army could pile in and try and attack the Republic for the Separatists. Once they did, they could swoop in around the Sith Empire and cut off their supply lines and launch a counter strike from both sides. It would allow the Republic to take some of the fight on while also disposing the Republic and the Sith Empire. In his mind, it was brilliant. To an extent, it also may have been brilliant. On the other hand, between the lines of Galactic War Map, there was a coalition of planets that, before the Battle of Geonosis or even the Battle of Coruscant, had signed peace treaties. For leaders like Duchess Satine of Mandalore, this was a no-brainer idea, mostly because she, looking in on the fragility of the Republic, could see that Palpatine was pushing for a war, and because Satine was neutral, she had many interactions with the Countess Sereno. But when the Sith army came around the corner, she hadn't expected both Palpatine and Dooku, who in her mind were on the opposing sides of combat, to be completely eradicated. Though with the neutral system coalition, Satine and her constituents saw an immediate issue. In a traditional war, the neutral systems wouldn't be touched, having signed both treaties with the Republic and the Separatists that they were out of the war, and remained peaceful. But with a foe like the Separatists and the Sith Empire vying for more power in the galaxy by taking over planets that were even neutral, she realized that being neutral didn't really make them safe. Especially with the Separatists taking over Ryloth within the first month, and the Sith Empire taking over notable worlds such as Mon Calamari, Bilbringi, Eridonia, Conquered Dawn, and Ithor within the first month. Mandalore sat in an unsafe part of the galaxy, and it was up to Duchess Satine to maneuver her way out of this. Of course, she knew that there was one way to do it, but it would have to undo everything the neutral system stood for, and everything her family had worked towards since the era of chaos ended on Mandalore. It was a tough moral decision for the Duchess because it didn't just involve her homeworld, it involved 1,000 of still non-conquered systems across the galaxy that hadn't yet faced down the Separatists or the Sith Empire. In a war, there are heroes and villains, and within the first month of combat, the lines had been drawn. It was up to the Republic and the heroes of its war effort to decide how they should tackle the incursion of the Separatists, and the Sith Empire especially, with both of which breathing down the necks of the neutral system coalition and that of the Republic as well. Our episode begins on the Temple Island on the planet of Ahch-To. Anakin Skywalker marched up the endless stairs leading to the top of the island where the Jedi Council had gathered. Anakin's presence came with a heavy burden. He came here to start a gripe with Master Windu. He was going to face down the newly crowned Grand Master and have a discussion with him. More so, Anakin was going to get into an argument with Windu because he believed he should be on the front lines, taking the fight back to the Sith, rather than just sitting here dormant on a planet doing nothing he was prepared yet to do. Anakin walked up the stairs, past the caretakers and towards the topmost part of the island. Anakin found the Jedi Council. There were a couple new members of the Council that had just been added since the fall of Coruscant, though Anakin wasn't all too concerned with who they were. Anakin raised his voice and called out Mace Windu by his name, as the Grand Master turned ever so slightly towards Skywalker. Mace knew what this was about, and he could tell by Anakin's ignorant attitude what kind of discussion this would be. Skywalker demanded to know why he was being forced to stay here in Ahch-To instead of taking back the Republic with the rest of the Jedi. Windu looked over at the other masters and excused himself as he stepped forward and looked at Skywalker. Before Windu could say a word, Anakin went off on a tangent. He started by saying that even Windu had to know that Anakin couldn't just teach these Jedi younglings, many of which who had already lost their master. Windu sighed as Anakin continued blasting away, talking about the responsibility he had to take on because Windu thought it would be a better idea to keep the Chosen One here on Ahch-To instead of with the clones. Windu stepped forward and without raising his tone, he told Skywalker that it was for this exact reason. It was because he wasn't yet able to come to terms with the predicament of the situation, because Anakin hadn't yet figured out that revenge wouldn't bring Kenobi back, just like it wouldn't bring back the senators or the Republic lost on Coruscant. And while Anakin had lost his mother not long before, it would be the same case for her. It wouldn't bring her back. His revenge and lust for it wouldn't make her return from the dead. She was gone, and that was a fact that Anakin had to come to terms with. Skywalker growled as he turned away and told Windu that he was being treated badly because Windu never liked him. Windu again, without raising his voice, spoke down to Skywalker, reminding him of his place. He may have been the chosen one, but there was no reason for any of the Jedi to trust him. While sure, there was a paradox of having faith in Skywalker, which Windu had, he didn't trust Anakin at all. He told Skywalker that while Kenobi and Yoda may have agreed that he may have been the chosen one wouldn't act like a repugnant child who had just received their first discipline. Windu continued telling Skywalker that he could keep him here on Ahch-To for the rest of the war if he wanted to, because this was much, much larger than simply insisting that because he was the chosen one, all would be right with the galaxy. Windu took one more step forward as he sized up Skywalker by standing up next to him and asserting his dominance. Skywalker reciprocated it, not sure whether to stand tall or back down. Windu noticed this as he continued and told Skywalker that there was much more at play. This wasn't about him or getting back at the Sith. This was about survival. And for Mace Windu, he had an entire Jedi Order to worry about, lest worry about an undisciplined spoiled little brat. Skywalker bit his lip and crunched his face, trying not to say anything, as a hand floated down towards his waist. Windu noticed this, and he didn't like it. He asked Skywalker if he'd really throw everything away, because he hadn't yet learned his place. Anakin looked into Windu's eyes as he turned his head away. Mace told Skywalker to return to the Garden Island and stay there until an appropriate punishment was levied against him for trying to raise his lightsaber against the Grand Master. Anakin took a deep breath, to which Windu asked if there was anything else he'd like to get off his chest. Skywalker shook his head and walked down the face of the island. Was Windu right? Most definitely. Did he handle it correctly? Not in the slightest. But Anakin was acting out of place. He was acting like the golden child when everyone had to be taken care of. He couldn't just be put wherever and whenever he wanted because he said so. He had a responsibility. Though in all fairness to Windu, showing up Skywalker like that put his ego in check, which is exactly what Anakin needed in a moment like this. Anakin eventually made his way back down to a speeder and shot back across the ocean over to the Garden Island so that he could think about what had just happened. The benefit of the Garden Island is that it would provide some level of comfort to him, to zero in on his feelings and on his thoughts, all of what mattered to him at this moment and how he would handle all of it effectively. When he turned, he ducked and made his way around the edge of the island to find himself some privacy, to which he would sulk while looking over the ocean and the massive waves it produced. His thoughts reflected onto all of what he'd lost. In the span of a week, he lost his mother, his master who he considered his father, and the love of his life, his mentor in Palpatine, and the entire place he called home. For a normal Jedi caught off from their emotions, it was rather easy to walk a fine line past all that trauma, but for someone like Anakin who wasn't cut off from his emotions, it was especially difficult. He sat on the edge of a mountain for hours. During this time, Mace had a conversation with the Jedi Council members. Firstly, a couple of them, while seeing Mace's point, wanted to ask about his decision to talk to Skywalker as he did. Mace reminded them how troublesome Skywalker could become if he wasn't kept on a tight leash, and so he made sure to make a point to show Anakin who was in charge, and that this operation at hand was much more important than the desire and wants for revenge for one of them. Skywalker was acting out of place, and he was treated accordingly for doing so. Regardless of which, Mace had a lot more important things on his plate. He informed Jocasta Nu that Skywalker was not to leave the Garden Island. She could do what she wanted from there, but he was being grounded as per request of the Jedi Council. Master Jocasta understood, and so she made a personal note to ensure that Skywalker didn't go out of line anywhere. Though there was only one issue: Anakin was missing. He couldn't be found anywhere, and that was an immediate issue for Master Jocasta. Because it's not like the Jedi wanted Anakin to run away. They just wanted him on the Garden Island until he was ready and mature enough to lead men into combat. There were lives at stake here, and they couldn't just throw a bunch of clones under Anakin Skywalker and expect him to take care of them like they were his own men, like they were his brothers in combat. Sure, the wisdom of the Council, in this particular circumstance, underestimated Anakin's ability to lead, but they were judging his ability to lead off of his most recent encounter with him, which didn't leave them with the most positive feeling about how he would lead clones. Regardless, Jocasta Nu sent out Natabre and a couple other Jedi Padawans and Knights to try and find Skywalker on the Garden Island. Barriss Offee was one of the other Padawans, being that she was just a year younger than Skywalker. Though Jocasta Nu wanted to be kept on the down low, she didn't want other Jedis to see wavering from the Chosen One. On the Temple Island, Mace Windu and the rest of the Jedi Council were having a meeting with the survivors of the Battle of Coruscant, as well as top clone strategists and commanders. It was the best of the best, especially of what remained. The Republic had very little thin supply lines to Kamino, and they didn't have the vessels to keep the line defended. It was a singular line of planets that arced around Separatist lines, but it didn't escape the bubble from which the Separatists had locked down. From Kamino there was Bathawai to Fallin, leading to Rhodia, Zar, and then to Sullus Van. Ahch-To was located in an unknown region of space inside the Outer Rim, and so it was safe. But this thin line across the Republic defenses was really weak. It wouldn't take much for the Separatists to attack it and break it. Though with the limited communication the Republic was getting from Bisk, Corellia, and Kuat, there seemed to be a chance that if they could connect to one of those 3 planets, the Republic would have a new fighting force. It was just a matter of getting them here or getting over there. Mace Windu discussed the best possible trajectory for finding victory on the battlefront, especially being that they had to utilize the Separatists as allies for the time being. It was the same realization that Admiral Trench came to. Of course, the only difference being that if the Separatists were attacked by the Republic, Admiral Trench would have no issue curb-stomping the Republic into submission. He wasn't going to do that just because it could cost him valuable resources in a war of which he needed all of his resources for. The Republic also knew the importance of this unsigned treaty. Though the Separatist government stationed on Raxus was coming to learn about how unfavorable their predicament had become. Of course, the Separatists had strong enough holds across the Mid-Rim and Outer Rim, such as Raxus, Sereno, and Hypori. They just didn't know when the best time was to take advantage of their resources. The Republic then committed to a strategy of combat that would take advantage of neutral sites, planets with little to no population to land their armies on, and then proceed from there with building listened outposts and simply forward command stations. Nothing too serious would go into these projects, but it would be a healthy way for the Jedi and the clones to get used to working alongside each other. And so it would also allow for the Republic to listen in on the Separatists and the Sith Empire. And so it was decided. The Jedi would start pairing up with different groups of clones to go out into the galaxy to settle on territory that hadn't yet been touched by the Sith or the Separatists. The mission statement was rather simple, and it was understood by the vast majority of troops involved in this process. While at the same time, Lama Su reported that the Kaminoans would begin rebuilding their cloning facilities on Borovio, and from there they could begin a new leg of the clone trooper program to ensure that the Galactic Republic had suitable forces for the war. The best part about Borovio is that it wasn't too far to sight from the Republic lines, so it would leave a fairly protected line, especially since it wasn't really on anyone's radar, and plus, the stations at Borovio were basically already constructed. A couple local systems in the area knew about the planet, but it wouldn't picture as a Republic stronghold. It would also be much safer for clones that had their growth acceleration at 10 times the normal rate of a human being. The clones grown on Borovio would be ready for combat within 2 years of training, and they wouldn't be outfitted with inhibitor chips because of the biology behind it. Across the galaxy at the center of everything, the Sith, who had done a fine job at establishing their lines of victory, slowed down. It wasn't their fault. They ran face first into a wall after marching across all the northern half of the galaxy. The Sith were a bit at a discombobulation, because without victory they had to deal with each other, which was always a cynical mistake for the Sith. They couldn't be around each other, and bickering always began immediately. The bickering wasn't always over something rather rudimentary, though there was one Sith from within the ranks who believed he could do more than the combined efforts of the Sith Empire, though the tragedy for this Sith in particular was his distinct inability to have a student of his own. It didn't matter. He was a powerful Sith Lord, and while he wasn't betraying the trust of the Sith from within his inner circle, he wouldn't stand around and simply be patient anymore. He couldn't do it. It wasn't the way of the Sith, and it was weak. Darth Sion knew better than to simply challenge every Sith Lord for authority, so, instead of authority, he stormed off, renouncing this order of Sith and informing them that he would do much better without them. The Sith didn't really care, actually. The reason Sion's decision came so fast was because he was pushed aside by Malgus. The Triumvirate was in the middle of taking over Molinist when Malgus swooped in and finished off the job for them. Not long after that, when the Sith returned to conquer their former home world of Ren Var, the 3 children of Vitiate came in and finished the job for the Triumvirate, which wasn't much, other than getting to the temple before they did. Nihilus couldn't care less. He knew the weight he carried, and Darth Traya didn't care either. But Sion, on the other hand, couldn't stand the fact that this was happening. He felt like the Sith didn't respect them, and he went ballistic. Traya told him to knock it off, to which he obeyed until this meeting with the other Sith Lords, where he felt insignificant to all of them. When Sion stormed off, he took a small detachment with him, around 1,200 men, and a starship to go into deep space. Sion remembered a Jedi home world, Of course, Coruscant was always a notable one, but he had one in mind of which he would like to go to. For Sion, it would be just. It would be right, and the Sith would have their revenge against the Jedi. All he cared about was slaughtering the Jedi and victory. That was the true issue for Sion. He was all too focused on the minor details, whereas the successful Sith of their time realized the importance of grandeur, which is why Revan, Malgus, and Vitiate each found success in their own times. In the same regard, it's why Darth Bane was actually respected at the table of Sith, because he didn't show such weaknesses. Lord Traya wasn't too concerned. She realized that this would either be the last time she saw her student, or his greatest lesson. Regardless of which, she still had Nihilus, who was always as loyal as could be when it came to serving her. Of course, on another note, she did have Revan and his little student in Malak, but she didn't care much for Malak and allowed Revan to be good at what he was good at. In Treya's mind, the strong would prevail in the ranks of the Sith and assert themselves in the roles they believed they should play, while the weak would always fill the role they were meant to fill, being servants to those with power. Though, in which respect she never saw Nihilus as incapable or weak. Rather, he wasn't a leader of his own. He did as he pleased, and he respected the wishes of his master, subservient in his own twisted way. On Ahch-To, Anakin Skywalker walked around the Garden Island. He was fighting with himself. He couldn't escape his demons. He avoided running into any Jedi, and by the time the night came around, he found solitude. He finally was alone, and yet the only thoughts dawning on his mind were those of running. He couldn't escape the memories of Obi-Wan, Padme, or his mother dying. They all sat in his mind, because Anakin put the responsibility on himself for not being able to save them. Anakin could have saved Obi-Wan had he been wiser and paid more attention to his surroundings at the Battle of the Jedi Temple. He could have done anything more to save them. He should have been on Tatooine when the Tuskens came for his mother, so that he could defend her. He should have been inside the Senate building, rushing Padme out before it was bombarded, but he wasn't. He held himself accountable for the mistakes of which weren't his fault. Anakin couldn't get over it, though. He couldn't escape that his failures led to the deaths of those he loved. The crashing of the waves in the dark night only continued to barrage him with the feelings of disappointment within himself. Anakin couldn't help but feel the draw to the darkness. It had always been there, but now was at the forefront of his mind. Anakin continued walking around the island silently. He looked across the oceans. He could feel the pull of the darkness. It lashed onto his heart and drew on him, as if it was begging for him to come closer, to try it, to envelop himself inside the dark side of the Force. Anakin couldn't resist the temptation. It was as if he were to fall into the dark side and would become free at last. But the truth is, he'd become a slave to the dark side. Anakin found a speeder, and while doing his best to avoid the guards, he took the speeder across the waters of Ahch-To. As the wind and the waves crashed by, he headed down below the Temple Island. The night was chilly already, but when Anakin entered the cave below, he felt colder. The planet of Ahch-To had a balance in the Force. There was just a powerful light and a powerful darkness. It was a matter of facing those. He stepped forward, his boots crunching down on seashells and moist rocks of the cave as he felt the Force flow around him. He felt a tornado of ruins. Anakin's mind was thrown into disarray as the room began spinning, and the sound of voices passed in and out of his ears. He heard Obi-Wan's final breath. He heard Shmi's voice. He heard the voice of Padme come out and tell him that she truly loved him. Anakin spun around, his eyes opened. He was staring in the darkness. Fog began to rise up around him as a heavy breathing could be heard. He heard the steps of heavy footsteps. Anakin looked around, and then a deep voice echoed off the walls, telling him it was a matter of time that he would see the path. A path far away from the Jedi. Anakin looked around on the ground around him, and then there were the bodies of the dead Jedi. Jocasta Nu, Plo Koon, Mace Windu, Natabre, and then, littered next to them, were the Padawans and younglings of the Jedi Order. Anakin looked up and saw a young Wookiee youngling growl, holding no lightsaber to defend itself. The voice laughed as it ignited a lightsaber, though the lightsaber of the Sith was held behind his back as it whipped around and swung through the Wookiee, cutting him to pieces. Anakin cried out as a voice told Skywalker that this is what he was called to do. This was where he deserved to be. Anakin felt his head. It was pulsating out of his body. He could feel the ground shake as Anakin demanded to know who it was. Before he could know, the fog vanished and the lightsaber did too. And then there was silence. Skywalker looked around the room without any visibility, and then he saw the mask of Nihilus rise before his eyes before disappearing. Moments later, he looked into the piercing eyes of Malgus, and then the heavy breathing that accompanied it. Skywalker was thrown from his feet as Darth Traya stood over him and said to him that the path from light to dark was easier than dark to light. Revan appeared next to her, telling Anakin that it would only be okay to join the darkness. It was power, all the power he ever wanted. Anakin screamed out and fell back. When he did, the little gem that Obi-Wan gave Skywalker flipped across his chest. It was a silicix oxalate that Kenobi gave Skywalker to give to the Duchess of Mandalore. Anakin looked at it. Before he could react, he heard Qui-Gon's voice. The voice asked Anakin if he believed he were the chosen one. Anakin looked around before he looked over and saw a pristine palace. It reminded him of Theed on Naboo. He saw young Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon Jinn standing next to him. Skywalker looked closely as Obi-Wan's eyes turned around and looked at him. The word failure darted out of his mouth again and again. Anakin asked why. Obi-Wan fell flat into the ground. Skywalker tried to roll him over, but when he did, his body turned to dust. Anakin felt a hand on his shoulder. The voice was calming. It was feminine, and it told Anakin to trust his intuition. It would not lead him astray. Skywalker turned, and all he saw was the back of a woman with flowing blonde hair. Anakin couldn't tell who it was, but before he could get a hold of this woman, he was thrown out onto the ground. Water fell from his mouth as he began coughing. His fist was balled up, and he opened his fist to see the gem that Kenobi gave him. Skywalker looked around and looked up. He heard footsteps. Skywalker looked for a rock to hide behind. He didn't want to start anything with anyone. He knew it was too risky to do that now. And the emotional drain from what he had just been through was a bit too much for him to deal with at this moment, and so he didn't want to confront anyone. He wanted to bypass them and escape. Skywalker looked out. He couldn't see much, but he could see lighter features. The robe being worn was a much lighter robe, and the figure was feminine. Anakin thought it was possibly Jocasta Nu, but when the face appeared from the shadows, it was much younger. The face was that of Anakin's favorite person in the galaxy at the moment, Natabre Morden. She had seemingly found her way to the Temple Island to find Skywalker and belittle him for being a fool. At least that's what Anakin thought. Anakin was in no part having that. He wasn't going to just deal with this again. Not that she was wrong, but he wasn't in the mood to deal with that amount of sass that she could easily distribute. Anakin heard his name called out by her. She looked everywhere. Anakin didn't peek out. He stayed hidden. Closing his eyes, Natabre stepped forward speaking out, saying that she wasn't here to fight. She simply wanted to bring him back to the Garden Island. Anakin thought of the words to say. He looked over his shoulder and saw her getting closer. She stopped and closed her eyes. She then asked Anakin what he was so afraid of, asking why he was so afraid to be on the island with all those students. Anakin looked back towards the cave from which she had just come. Natabre told Anakin that they were both Jedi. They both had a duty to be here for each other, to be united as one. Anakin slowly got up as he leaned against the rock he sat behind and looked over at her. Anakin's fear was noticeably written across his face. He looked down and he looked back up at her. He told her that he needed to go. She asked why he would betray the Jedi. Anakin shook his head, telling her that he wasn't, but not even he could believe that statement. Natabre told Anakin that she couldn't understand everything he had to say, but she would try. Anakin stepped forward telling her that he needed to go. That's what he needed to do in this moment, though Natabre was too stubborn to just let Anakin go off without explanation. She wanted proof that he wasn't just leaving the Jedi Order to join the Sith. Anakin looked away, and so Natabre dug deeper, asking why he came here to this cave. Skywalker looked at her and told her that she was awfully pushy. She looked at him and explained that she needed to do what was best for the Order. If being pushy was what was best for the Order, then it was for the best. Anakin looked at her and started walking forward, but she put her hands up and stopped him. She asked where he was going then. Anakin looked at her with a glare. She knew this look and asked if he was really going to start a fight with her rather than admit that he was too cowardice to talk about the emotions that he clearly had. Anakin's hand dropped to his belt as he grabbed his blade. Natabre didn't hesitate. She looked at his hand and then back to him, telling him to do it, to embrace the darkness by striking her down. It would make him no better than the Sith that killed his master and her master. Anakin gritted his teeth and stormed away. Natabre looked at him as he walked away. She asked if he was really going to forfeit everything. Anakin didn't respond as he made his way to the top side of the mountain, as he found himself a starfighter and left. Natabre, on the other hand, took a deep breath and fell to her knees. She sat alone in the cave. This was the first time she had a moment to take in everything. She had to be strong ever since she arrived at Ahch-To. She never got a final word with her mentor. She never even got to say goodbye. She had to pretend that everything was going to be okay, so that the younglings didn't fear for their lives. And yet, here she was. facing down Anakin Skywalker. She knew that if he pulled his lightsaber, she would have died. There was no way in which she would be able to defend herself from him long enough. Maybe she could have, but the chances are she would have lost her life. Anakin was, well, Anakin. She was a decent duelist, but she'd be remiss if she didn't admit how many times she almost died during the siege of the temple. The Tabri looked at the ground. A tear slid from her cheek and flopped off her chin and landed on her robes. Her heart slowed down. It was in an accelerated pace as she faced down Anakin. She looked at the ground and her emotions rolled out. She knew she was a Jedi, and she knew she should be better than this, but it wasn't as easy as it sounded. Our episode begins inside of the cockpit with Anakin Skywalker. He was setting up the ship to jump to lightspeed. He was in a single fighter. He would be able to traverse across enemy lines, going essentially undetected. Anakin jumped from system to system, avoiding Separatist fleets and the Sith Empire fleets as well. During one of his jumps, he accidentally found himself on the front lines of combat. Skywalker was very taken aback by the battlefront he came across. It was the Separatists and the Sith Empire trying to cut at each other's throats. It was a tense battle, but it also was ferocious. The droids had superior numbers and several wings of bombers and vulture droids piled up towards the flagship of the Sith Empire. Anakin looked at it and watched as it exploded. The Sith Empire fleet began to turn away from combat and the Separatists pushed harder and harder, destroying ships as they moved to retreat. Skywalker took note of this as he hit the forward throttle and jumped to hyperspace. He was at the last jump before he got to the system he was trying to get to. From Saleucami, it was his next destination. Elsewhere in the galaxy, a Jedi outpost sat quietly on Tython. Jedi Master Imogen D and his students stood quiet on patrol. They had amassed a small unit of clone troopers, nearly 600 men or so, to defend this forward outpost. It obviously wasn't enough men to defend the entire planet, but it was simply just supposed to be a forward command post for the Republic. The planet was kind of out of the way, and the Sith had no real reason to invade it, neither did the Separatists, because there wasn't really any people here. Of course, on the newly charted galactic maps, there is no one here. That's what the population said. No one. But the truth is, there were 600 clones and 2 Jedi present. They all waited around, doing patrols and everything of the sort. The forward command post here essentially was a listening station, set up to intercept communication going in and out between the Separatist lines and the lines of the Sith Empire. Everything that was recorded was sent back to the Republic across the Outer Rim, so they had information about their enemy. Though there was a darkness approaching, and Imogen D and his Rhodian student, Vermi Cross, could feel it in the Force, and so they ordered their men to ready themselves for battle in the circumstance that the Separatists or the Sith Empire was coming. Tython was a lush world with several mountain ranges. In between those mountains sat a former Jedi temple. It was here that the outpost had been set up, and it was here where the listening post and the clones were too. Everything operated out of the former Jedi temple on Tython, and it was like a secondary home for the Jedi at this point in the war. The clones rather enjoyed the area, especially because early on in the war, it wasn't too difficult to just enjoy themselves. The clones here didn't have to use their training, they simply got to enjoy the pleasantries of life. Of course, they still trained day to day, but they did that to stay in peak condition. Other than that, they just simply went on patrol and made sure that they were receiving communication from other parties across the galaxy. That wasn't until the communication array picked up a frequency rapidly approaching the planet. The clones and the Jedi closed up the Jedi Temple and turned off all communication devices, taking out all the hard drives and keeping them in case there was an attack. They were going to try and use the element of surprise against whoever was landing. With the element of surprise, the clones could likely use their lower numbers to an advantage, make 600 men feel like 6,000 men. When the transports landed, the clones were hidden in the forest, inside of caves and inside of the Jedi Temple. Imogen D and Vermi stood side by side with each other inside of the forest. They looked out and saw a warrior of the Sith march out surrounded by 2 marauders and a number of Sith troopers. When they exited the transports, they left at a fast pace, but once they got into formation, they began to slow-paced march through the woods. Once the Jedi had them cornered, they launched an all-out assault on the Empire forces. The Imperial troops were caught off guard as the clones blasted away, cutting through the lines of the troops, though they were heavily outnumbered. Imogen D and his student took a step forward into battle position, while inside the caves and temple, Captain Keeley and the rest of the troops waited patiently for their go-ahead. Imogen D contacted Captain Keeley and ordered them to launch the counter-assault. The 400 men were outnumbered 3-1, and the clones were fighting an opponent who were trained just as well as they were. These were not battle droids. These were effective troopers, and they were very precise with their aiming and their targeting. The two Marauders guiding Sion were dispatched to take on the Jedi, while the Sith Lord stood in the middle, watching his men be executed, and then watching the clones who ambushed them be struck down by blaster fire. The battle was an all-out war, as the best troopers fought with each other. Clones were gunned down as the Marauders engaged with the two Jedi on the battlefield. As it began to look grim for the clone troopers, the rest of their reinforcements came out of the temple and the caves, and they began to open fire on the Sith troopers. Captain Keeley and the rest of the 200 men got into the mix. The clones on the front lines watched as Lord Sion emerged from the ranks of his men, cutting down the wounded and throwing his lightsaber through one of his own troops in front of him. Sion marched to the front lines with his men, and they began to make a push on the clones led by Captain Keeley. The two Jedi were able to cut down the Marauders, though in the process of their duel, the majority of their men had been killed. The Sith troopers started making their way for the Jedi Temple. Their effort was flawless as the clones began to retreat to a more defendable position. Sion could feel the presence of the Jedi making their way through the back of his lines, and so he whipped around his head and looked at the two Jedi as they stammered. Captain Keeley tried to call out to Ima-Gun-Di, but the moment he made contact, Ima-Gun-Di ordered the clones to retreat. The Jedi would hold off the Sith for now. The clones began to retreat through the open field, causing dozens of them to be cut down by blaster fire as they closed in on the Jedi Temple. Sion, on the other hand, twirled around and he swung his lightsaber down and clashed with Ima-Gun-Di. The Jedi Master told his student to assist the clones, but he couldn't. Before he could respond to the order, Sion lifted him up into the air with the Force and threw him into a tree nearby, knocking him out. Sion grinned as he used his brute strength to attack Gun-Di. The Jedi Master was a strong species, naturally strong that is, but Sion was a beast. He used his power and precision to force Ima-Gun-Di off of his game, pushing him backwards. Sion swung harder and faster. Gun-Di's defense could only hold for so long, and then his lightsaber was cut out of his hands as the blade toppled to the ground. Gun-Di turned around and used the Force to pull his student's lightsaber as he blocked a strike by Sion. The Sith Lord saw this to be funny. As he pushed harder, Ima-Gun-Di responded with a parry and a strike as he made his way back to an offensive stance against the Sith Lord. It was very evident that the Jedi Master was a solid duelist. The Sith Lord fell backwards and saw his advantage slip away from out under him. Sion spun around, cutting a tree into pieces as it tumbled down towards Ima-Gun-Di. The Jedi Master reacted, moving out of the way, and then facing down Sion. The Sith Lord threw his lightsaber forward. Ima-Gun-Di's grip wasn't strong as it typically would be with his own blade. He took the hit and then watched as Sion used the Force to pull the lightsaber back towards him, jumping into the air and swinging down on Ima-Gun-Di. Ima-Gun-Di fell back, and Sion jabbed his lightsaber through Ima-Gun-Di's chest, killing him immediately. Sion didn't take much time getting around to Ima-Gun-Di's student, and while he was knocked out, gutting him. By the time Sion got back to the battle at hand, he looked over and saw the clones had been pushed back inside the Jedi Temple. There were about 150 clones remaining, with Sion's numbers just about 700 men. The clones did a solid job at their defense, but they were outnumbered by a fighting force that had solid trading. Sion demanded the Sith army to go into the Jedi Temple and fish out the clone troopers and execute them. They followed their orders, as inside, Captain Keeley and his men were reaching out for the Republic, trying to see if they could get reinforcements. Keeley knew the Jedi were dead, and he realized that at this point, they had a better shot of waiting the Sith order out rather than trying to attack in a frontal assault. They didn't have the numbers to pull it off, and they sent their message and departed for the interior of the temple and the cave system attached in the inside. On the other side of the galaxy, Anakin Skywalker arrived outside of Mandalore. Anakin felt called to come here. Something about his vision made him feel inclined to come to Mandalore and find this Duchess that Obi-Wan had mentioned in his last breath. When Anakin got down to the capital city, he was immediately taken into custody. Mandalore had become a very tense planet. While sure, Satine was against traditional warrior ways, the truth is that she knew the importance of standing up against the Sith Empire. As a leader of the Neutral System Coalition, a group of around 1,500 star systems across the galaxy, she understood that peace wasn't an option with a group of psychos that did not want peace. Satine made an effort to have peace, but when star system after star system, Republic, Separatist, or Neutral, all faded out of existence, she realized the importance of standing her ground. While her sister was a part of the psychopathic group of megalomaniacs called Death Watch, Satine made an effort to cut off all ties to the moon of Concordia and lock down what they had here at Mandalore. Mandalore sat in a sweet spot between enemy lines, between the Sith Empire and the Separatist. Her only fear was who would come down first. The Sith Empire wasn't going to go to Mandalore because of their past attempts to deal with the Mandalorians, all of which being travesties from each of their own respective eras. Meanwhile, the Separatists were leaving Mandalore alone because they weren't psychos. Sure, they were fighting against the Republic, but the Sith Empire was a slightly bigger fish to fry, and Mandalore was neutral, so it's not like they had to worry about them. The other surviving neutral systems made an effort to militarize, but none of them could do it as well as Mandalore could. Satine had access to thousands of wartime machines that were used in the Civil War, of which she came to power in. Did she want to use them? Of course not, but the safety of her people came first, and she was going to ensure her people remained defended. Regardless, when Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker was brought to the throne room to face her, she was very confused. She would have assumed that it would have been Obi-Wan Kenobi, though she was truly worried. She had heard reports about what happened to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, and she feared for the worst. Though, when her guards brought in Anakin Skywalker, she was confused. She firstly asked why Anakin was here and what his name was. Anakin admitted that he wasn't really sure why he was here, but his master was Obi-Wan Kenobi. Satine subtly gasped. She looked at Anakin and asked if he was alright. Anakin looked away. He frowned, looking back up to her and revealing in his hand a little medallion. Anakin told Satine that he was unaware of his own place in the galaxy, but Obi-Wan's last breath were to give this medallion to her. So he decided that that would be the first thing he would do before deciding where his place was in the entire galaxy. Satine stepped forward and looked down at Anakin's hand. She recognized the medallion. She'd given it to Obi-Wan right before he and Qui-Gon left Mandalore for the final time. She looked away, choking on her tears in sorrow. She held her breath and forced the tears back as she turned back to tell Anakin that his master was the kindest, most gentle man she'd ever met. Anakin smiled. Yeah, he and Obi-Wan butted heads a lot, but what Satine said was true. Obi-Wan was a kind soul, guided by the Force, and by a beautiful light that sat within his heart. Anakin lifted the medallion up and handed it to Satine, as he asked what it symbolized. Satine told Anakin that Obi-Wan and her had an extended mission when he was a Padawan. During that extended mission, as far as Satine was concerned, they fell in love. It seemed as if it were true, because Obi-Wan's last thoughts were of her. Satine carried on by telling Anakin that she didn't want to force Obi-Wan to choose between the Jedi Order and her, because she knew how much he cared about being a Jedi. Part of her always wished she told him about how much she loved him, but she knew she couldn't take the Jedi away from him. Little did Satine realize that had she said the word, he would have left the Jedi Order. Satine took the medallion, and inside of it was a small crystal. The crystal, when given to Kenobi, was clean, but when she looked at it, there were scribbles on it. Though when Satine took a deeper look, she noticed somewhat of a translation, in Mandalorian that is. She giggled for a moment, remembering Obi-Wan and how he used to try and speak her native language to appease her when they were on the run. She always made fun of him for it, of course in a loving way, to which he always responded with an equal level of sass and wit. The saying written inside a medallion was mostly correct, but the sentence said, "My heart will forever belong to you." Satine looked at Anakin and asked if she could excuse herself for a moment as she stepped out of the room. It was too hard to hold her tears back, upon learning of Obi-Wan's death, but this confirmed what she always believed, that even the Jedi way couldn't keep them separated, star-crossed lovers if you will. Part of her was saddened that she never got to tell him the truth, but the other part of her was always happy to know that Obi-Wan likely knew the truth, just waiting for her to make the move that she needed to make. Eventually, Satine returned and asked Skywalker if he would take a walk with her. He nodded his head, and the two of them started off. Satine asked Anakin why he was questioning his purpose in all of this. Anakin started to tell her about everything that had happened, that apparently, like Obi-Wan, he too fell in love with someone with political power. Though, for him, the inverse happened because she died in the Battle of Coruscant. Satine was saddened to hear of the death of Padme Amidala, but she was also saddened to hear for Anakin's struggles. For Satine, she felt a connection to Skywalker, because to her, Anakin was Obi-Wan's student. Because she loved Obi-Wan as much as she did, she believed it was her duty to fill in where Kenobi could not, and so she told Skywalker that she might not be a Jedi, but she fell in love with one. She told Anakin that he should trust his intuition. It will not lead him astray. Anakin nodded his head, and then he looked back, telling her that he was confused. She then reminded Anakin that the strongest are forged from darkness. Anakin too would learn that should he continue down this road. She asked Anakin what he thought Obi-Wan would say to him. Anakin smiled slightly and stopped it. He looked over at her. He said that Obi-Wan would have likely reminded Anakin that the Force was his ally, not his competition. Obi-Wan would have looked into Anakin's eyes to remind him that he was much more incredible than he ever gave himself credit for, though Obi-Wan would have likely humbled him immediately afterwards by telling him to be more patient with the process. Satine smiled and pointed at him. It was patience that he needed. Anakin smiled and looked down. Satine put her hand on Anakin's shoulder. She told Anakin the path was his to choose. The choices were his to make, but Obi-Wan, no matter what, would always be with him. Anakin looked at her, to which Satine pointed to Anakin's chest, suggesting that Anakin will carry Obi-Wan in his heart on his journey. He just needed to trust himself to make the right decision. Anakin thanked her for all of her kindness and guidance. He asked her if there was anything he could do in return. She shook her head before saying to Anakin to keep making Obi-Wan proud, because as long as he was proud, she would be too. Anakin should always remember that he has friends here on Mandalore. Anakin thanked her and bowed respectfully. She watched as Anakin left, and then she looked down at the medallion and wrapped it around her neck, and almost immediately felt Obi-Wan's presence, or as Satine would simply refer to him, as Ben. As Skywalker made his way back to Ahch-To, a communication came into the Republic High Command. The Jedi Council was discussing a lack of communication coming in from Master Ima-Gun-Di from the planet of Tython. Captain Keeley came over the comlink and informed the Jedi that Tython had fallen. The Sith were here. They had killed most of their forces. Jedi Master Ima-Gun-Di and his student were killed in combat. There was one Sith Lord present. He wasn't holding back, and the comlink cut out. Blaster fire rang out, and from the corners of the room, Captain Keeley cried out, telling his men to fall back, before the sound of a lightsaber ignited, and swooping and swooshing through the clones could be heard, before the communication was cut off by a thermal imploder, likely thrown by a clone trooper trying to protect the location of the Jedi. It worked, but the clones and their fate were undecided. The Jedi Council and the rest of the high-ranking military personnel stood in silence. They all thought about what to do. Admiral Yularen informed the Jedi that this was not a time for rush action. There was no guaranteeing that those troops survived, let alone having to sacrifice a fleet to destroy a Sith fleet. Though the issue was that there wasn't a Sith fleet. It was just simply a landing party. Commander Cody came over the intercom and told the Jedi and the Admiral that they could dispatch a recon group of clone commandos to Tython to discover what had happened and if there was any real purpose to send an invasion force to Tython in the first place, because Tython had information they needed. Windu looked over at the other council members as they nodded their heads, but first Windu asked if there were any available commandos. The truth is, a lot of commandos had been killed at the Battle of Geonosis, and there weren't a lot of them to begin with. Most of the commandos were doing intense covert missions across the core and northern galactic map where most of the Sith Empire had ravaged the galaxy, trying to start up rebel cells and even reported there were survivors of fallen worlds, though Commander Cody told the Jedi that there was a squad of commandos coming out of Kamino in need of positioning. They could either be sent to Tython or they'd be sent somewhere else in the galaxy that likely needed backup or troops and support. The Council elected to send them to Tython in the circumstance that there were any survivors. The Jedi were mostly looking for clone survivors. For the clones inside the meeting, this was very important. It showed them that the Jedi valued them, even after learning that their brethren had died in combat. Commander Cody would exit the call and dispatch a squad of commandos to Tython to report back about what had happened there. Hours later, a missing starfighter landed at the surface of the Temple Island on Ahch-To. Anakin got out of the ship. After the temple guards almost stunned him, Anakin made his way to the top of the temple island. He climbed the stairs, pacing himself as he made his way up to the stairs as he looked for Master Windu. When Anakin saw him, his heart pace picked up. The truth is, he was nervous. He almost started a fight with the Jedi Master that had no issue beating him up if he challenged him. Windu wasn't exactly pleased to see Skywalker. Anakin assumed it was because of the fighter being stolen, but actually, Master Fisto stumbled upon Natabre the night Anakin left. Anakin looked a little confusedly. He understood tensions were high, but he didn't do anything to her. Windu told Skywalker he had a lot of explaining to do. Anakin nodded his head, as he prefaced his apology with an apology. He explained that he had lost his mother on Tatooine before the Battle of Geonosis. He didn't have time to process his emotions, and he admitted that while he was a Jedi, and that was an excuse, he was going to be honest. Because Anakin could feel emotions more than a typical Jedi, and he tried to shut them off, but it pushed him to a dark side. Instead of going to the dark side, Anakin went down into the cavern below the Temple Island, and was presented with a Force vision. During the vision, he saw Obi-Wan, and his master showed him the medallion that he gave Anakin before his death. Anakin explained that he was confronted by Natabre at a bad time. He didn't want to hurt her, and so he didn't, but he needed to give the medallion to the Duchess of Mandalore. Windu was beyond confused, literally, just so confused. This didn't make any sense, none at all actually. But Skywalker finished everything off, saying he needed time to think alone. Being in a cockpit was the best way for him to do that. Obi-Wan's friend from Mandalore helped him with his grieving process in relation to his master, and so Anakin, because of Satine, Obi-Wan, and yes, Natabre too, felt the call to return to the Jedi and serve them in the best way possible. Anakin told Windu, especially, that he was sincerely sorry for his actions and the stresses he caused others. Anakin admitted that all the attention came from believing he would fail those around him because he was the chosen one. Obi-Wan was an incredible master, and he did it at such a young age. He was as wise as Master Yoda and as powerful as Master Windu. Anakin was very fortunate to have him as a master, and it was because Anakin didn't believe he could live up to the expectations set in stone by Obi-Wan. Windu, in a way, actually understood where Anakin was coming from. Did he trust Anakin? Not at all. But this was a step in that right direction. Anakin coming forward, admitting his wronging, was something that was profoundly mature for him to do, especially since he got away with being disobedient from time to time with Kenobi. Windu accepted the apology, and then requested that Skywalker return to the Garden Island until he had further instructions to give to him. Anakin nodded his head and smiled at the Jedi Council. Inside of Skywalker's head, he heard Obi-Wan's voice tell him that he was proud of him. It was something that made Anakin's eyes water up as he walked down the steps of the Temple Island. When Anakin crossed the seas of Ahch-To, the first person he ran into was Master Jocasta Nu. Anakin swallowed his pride once again, and told her that he was truly sorry. She nodded her head and simply smiled, telling Anakin Skywalker that she was just happy he had come back. That was the consensus of what Anakin was learning in this moment. The Jedi were just so happy that they had one more brother on their side. It wasn't about numbers or statistics, it was about staying strong, keeping the path of the Jedi, and while Anakin had made his mistakes, he was coming around to making them right. Anakin stayed around Jocasta Nu, helping her out with anything she needed help with. That is until nighttime rolled around, which in reality was only an hour after Anakin arrived on the Garden Island. Jocasta Nu told Anakin that, despite his journey, it was time to take on responsibility. Anakin smiled and agreed. Jocasta told Anakin that he would be managing the first watch of the night. Anakin simply smiled and responded with a simple yes, master. Darkness covered the island. In the time that Anakin had been gone, there had been a little bit of construction on the Garden Island. A little bit of coverings and technology to house the infants of the Force, the ones who had no biological defenses from the natural world. Other than that, it was very much so a work in progress. Anakin wandered around the island, keeping an eye on everyone, making sure everyone was alright. As Anakin kept walking, a little boy ran up to him and asked him if he would be leaving again. Anakin looked down and then looked from side to side before kneeling. Skywalker told the boy that he would do whatever the Council needed him to do. He was a Jedi, and he needed to be sure he did what was best for the Jedi. The little boy smiled and told Anakin that when he got older, he wanted to be just like him. Anakin smiled and told the boy to run back to sleep. The next day would be full of hard work and training. The boy nodded and responded with a yes, master, before darting away into the darkness. Anakin kept walking as he made his rounds. Everything was silent, everything other than the sounds of waves crashing and the slight chill bouncing down his neck and up his sleeves from the wind. As Anakin walked back to his spot, rested a little bit above the rest of the people so that he had a better view, he heard a twig break. Anakin turned around and looked at the flowing robes behind him. Anakin frowned. He asked Natabre if she would mind coming up to the post with him. She nodded her head and followed him up. The two of them sat down, to which Anakin tried to speak first, but Natabre hushed him. Anakin was a little taken aback, but he listened intently. Natabre told Anakin that she owed him an apology. Anakin shook his head, but she gave him again another quick hush to stop shaking his head. Natabre told Anakin that she was sorry for being so pushy, for demanding answers when he didn't have them, for being so stubborn. Anakin grinned. She asked what was so funny. Anakin told her that her stubbornness was greatly needed, but he could also see where the rest of the apology was coming from. Natabre's eyebrows rolled back and she looked at him with a glare, but not an angry glare. Natabre continued as she told Anakin that she often, much like many Jedi, could easily forget that Skywalker wasn't born inside the Order. He had a life, a family, and emotions for several years before he even was told to forget about them. Anakin told Natabre that he accepted the apology, but he would first have to apologize to her. She looked at him and nodded her head, suggesting he go ahead with whatever it was that he wanted to say. Anakin told her that he was truly sorry about how the entire last couple encounters had been handled. There were an array of things that Anakin could blame them on, but he took the responsibility in this moment. He owned his mistake, regardless of what charged those feelings, and he admitted his wronging. Natabre too accepted the apology. Natabre then decided to share that she acted out of line because she wanted to express her emotions, but her training taught her otherwise. Her master was a code purist, but when she was faced with adversity like losing someone she cared about and the place she'd called home for 18 years, she didn't know how to properly convey it. Anakin nodded his head and told her that he understood. His mother died before Geonosis, and then Anakin carried on throughout the rest of those that he lost. Padme, Obi-Wan, the Order. Though Anakin admitted that he learned the value of being a Jedi. Natabre looked at Anakin with interest. Anakin told her that it was the ability to trust in the Force, trust in training, and believe that everything would work out just fine in the end. It was an interesting look at everything. Anakin ended up asking Natabre where her robes came from, and why she was wearing robes of the High Republic era. Natabre giggled, before telling Anakin that it was a family heirloom. Anakin was a little confused until she told him that members of her family had been a part of the Jedi Order for the last 543 years. She was the most recent member of her family to become a Jedi. Anakin didn't understand how at all that was possible. The Jedi don't allow attachments. Natabre rolled her eyes, telling Anakin that she had a very large family, large enough to keep repopulating while sending family members to the Jedi Order, and so, because it was a family robe, it was passed down to her. Inside of her room at the Jedi Temple, there were robes that could fit different future members of the Order, tall, skinny, large, short, whichever. Anakin apologized. The temple was really Natabre's home, and it belonged to her ancestors for 500 years. Natabre smiled and told him that it'd be alright. Everything would turn out better for the two of them. The two of them continued talking throughout the night, getting to know different aspects about each other. Anakin would tell her about his little trip to Mandalore, and she would tell him about her adventures she had with her master before the Battle of Coruscant. For Anakin and Natabre, they had just ignited a flame of friendship, something ever so crucial in an era of chaos. Our episode begins on the stormy world of Kamino. A squad of clone commandos had just finished their training. The squad was getting ready to be shipped to the front lines. The Kaminoan in charge of their training told them to return to their rooms. There was a mission statement being sent to them, instructing each of them what their goal was. The recorded transmission was coming in from Commander Cody. Currently, Commander Cody was on the front lines, waiting out the Sith Empire. Combat had ceased, and Cody was sending this message to the commandos so that they could go to Tython and do some reconnaissance for the Republic. The 4 clone commandos split up and walked into their own respective rooms, which were all layered in next to each other. The leader of the group walked into his own quarters. His name was Zan. He walked into the room and sat his helmet down on his bed as he sat down next to it. The message from Cody popped up, and out came the message informing him what the squad would be doing. Commander Cody informed Zan that his job was to exclusively go to the planet Tython for a reconnaissance mission. He was not to engage the enemy. Cody reinforced this by referring to Zan and his men as rookies. Their job was simply to get a readout and see if there were any survivors of the attack on the base. There was no reason to engage. Cody also continued by informing that if all the clones were dead, there was a clone captain present who had all the information that hadn't been transmitted back to the Republic. The information that the clone captain had could be very informative to the war effort, so if the commanders got a hold of that information, they needed to get out immediately. Zan watched as the communication came to an end before him. Zan made a personal note to himself to make sure that he did everything in his power to avoid any conflict. A small holomap came through the comlink from Commander Cody. It showed the entire layout of the entire facility. It also revealed the location of a hidden cave within the temple. Zan looked at everything and took it in. As the commander of his squad, he had to be very analytical and informed, but these were attributes that belonged to him naturally. In the next door, Burst walked into his room, as they kicked the hologram as it turned on, and the mission statement from Commander Cody came in. Cody informed Burst that as a squad sniper, it was his job to ensure that the Sith troopers didn't get a hold of them. He had to scout out the majority of the area before they went in. Burst was also the pilot of the squad. Well, all the commanders could pilot, but Burst was the designated pilot, and he was the best of the 4. Cody told Burst that he was to land way beyond the reaches of the mountain range. They'd be departing from Kamino at 0700. Per the calculations, they would be able to arrive at Tython in the middle of the night and land on the dark side of the planet. They could traverse the jungle and get to the ground while the Sith army wasn't fully awake or fully prepared. Cody was under the assumption that the Sith Empire had deployed a fleet, which was far from the truth. The Sith came in transports, and so the clone squad wouldn't have to worry about a fleet to avoid. Burst understood the mission, as Cody told him to avoid combat at all costs. He understood the mission that sat before him. The door beside Burst was occupied by a squad mate, Red-Eye. This clone commando was a bit more of a tech-savvy individual, and his personality revolved around intelligence. He was hyper-focused on taking advantage of the most advantageous situation he was presented with. Red-Eye got his nickname for his inability to rest. He was someone who stayed up most nights possible. He didn't slow down and he studied everything. The message that he got from Cody was very similar to the message that was sent to Zan, but this message included important locations to check inside the Jedi Temple on Tython. Of course, Zan got all this information, but the type of locks on the doors, the material used, and all the other analytical data that might be important went to Red-Eye. Cody ended the message showing each of the control ports inside of the Jedi Temple, given over by the Jedi. The mission was really clear to Red-Eye, and so he lay down after taking his gear off. The final clone was a bit of a psycho. He was quiet, but he also loved the thrill of combat. He stormed into his room, throwing his backpack to the side and turned on the holo transmitter. The message came in from Commander Cody and addressed the clone as Flame. That was his nickname. Flame dropped his helmet and waited for the orders. Cody informed Flame of the same mission details, but told him especially that this mission was a covert op. It was not meant to blow anything up or everything up in sight. His primary focus was to keep quiet. There would be no reason to be blowing anything up in this mission. If he did, the entire mission could crash down into a failure. Zan would fill him in on any questions he might have. Flame turned off the communicator before rolling his eyes and speaking quietly to himself about how their first op was going to be a wasteful mission sneaking around. Flame understood the importance of commando work, but he did like to get into firefights. He specialized in the combat area, and he was an enthusiast of all types of combat. He was one of the more Mandalorian-like commandos, hyper-focused on the aspect of combat rather than the importance of recon. Regardless, the day would pass in the night, and the clones would have their mission. In the morning, they would be loading out. Zan woke his squad up an hour before deployment so they could make sure everything was ready to go. Zan was a bit of an over-worrier. His focus on his mission, of course, was important to him, but he stressed out about being on time with everything. It was a type of precision that no one could really program into him. Burst and Red-Eye were ready to go, while Flame showed some reluctance for the excitement of their first mission. To an extent, Zan understood, but he also knew that they were soldiers. What they wanted had to come after what they needed to do. Zan picked up the motivation and instructed the boys to get to the ship and be ready for liftoff. They were leaving soon. The other three got to work, but Flame was busy putting explosives and larger weapons into the shuttle. For example, the rotary blaster cannon. It was essentially a battalion of clones and a gun. As a commando, their primary weapon was a DC-17M, but Flame liked to have extra accessories. While yes, the DC-17M had plenty of accessories, like a scope, a grenade launcher, and even some other abilities, Flame preferred to lug around extra weaponry, because he was just extra. Zan noticed the weapon stashed inside the vessel and reminded Flame that this was a reconnaissance mission, to which Flame looked at the squad leader and told him that he understood. He was just staying prepared. Zan turned away and prepared his squad to load up and lift off. Within the hour, everything was ready, and Burst jumped into the cockpit and took off. Camino was as rainy as ever, and the squad of clones departed for Tython. When the ship entered hyperspace, Zan gathered the group up in the center of the cargo area. He pulled out a hologram and made a point to pick out each strategic landing point for them. There were mountains in the quadrant that they were landing in, but there were also to be expected several troops present. When they landed, their first job was to scout out everything below the mountain, see if they could pinpoint any strategic locations that weren't on the holomap, and see if there were any identifiable leaders of the Sith army, and how many estimated troops there were on the ground. The men were all ready, and they were well prepared. Though it would be remiss to mention that nerves were also high. These were no longer the simulations. These rookies were going to be reconning a battlefield where nearly 600 men and 2 Jedi had gone missing from. There was confirmation that the Jedi had been killed, but the number of clones that survived had not yet been revealed. Eventually, the shuttle exited hyperspace. Red-Eye sat in the co-pilot's seat as he called out to Zan to report that there weren't any larger ships appearing on the radar. Zan nodded his head as he told them to keep their frequencies quiet, just to be safe. If the Sith had left, then it would make their mission a lot easier. That was the assumption, too. It seemed as if the Sith came here for a raid and abandoned everything. Flame sat in the cockpit quietly. He looked over the holomap, for anything else that might have been missed. The night was dark as the Republic shuttle rounded the planet, making its way for the trees and landing behind a mountain range. The clones all immediately deployed. Zan told Red-Eye and Flame to scout out the lower area, and remember to not engage with any troopers unless necessary. Zan and Burst were going to climb the mountain and scout out the area below. The ascent began. It wasn't too difficult. The clone commanders were equipped with numerous tools that their brothers in the regular army didn't get. As the clones scaled the mountain, Zan pointed Burst to a grouping of bushes and trees. The clones both set up in the bushes as Zan pulled out the hollow binoculars as Burst ready to scope and lined it up, of course making sure that the safety was still on. Burst reported that there were 24 troopers marching around. Zan noted that in front of the Jedi Temple, there was a shirtless individual walking around with a lightsaber attached to his belt. Burst moved his scope around and noticed that on the grounds of the facility there were 15 guards standing post, though they didn't look like they were all too focused. On the front steps, the apparent Sith was talking to an apparent commander of this force. Zan moved his binoculars up and scouted the mountain range. He took note of the fact that the mountains seemed to be empty. Burst moved his reticle up and noticed that the same thing. The two started talking about their best entry possible. Zan took down his binoculars and pulled up a holomap on his wrist, and noted that if the clones opened up a small hole in the top of the facility, then he'd be able to drop into the Jedi Temple and move around relatively freely. Burst agreed that it was a good idea. Though Burst took his reticle down and looked over, there is no clear way to get across to the mountains behind the Jedi Temple. The only way would be to descend, cross a river twice, and then scale a mountain right next to the 15 guards. Zan took note of that as he got out of the bushes and crouched his way towards the edge of the mountains. Burst followed his squad leader as he moved behind a grouping of trees and stood up. Zan lifted his rifle and told Burst that they had the ability to zipline across over to the other mountain range, though the issue is how they could do it without being seen or caught, considering Republic Commando gear was shiny and white. Burst admitted that it would be a difficult thing to do, but they needed to make a decision now, because the sun would rise in nearly 80 minutes. Zan called over his comlink and reported to Red-Eye and Flame and told them to scale the mountain. They'd be ziplining across to the other mountain range. Zan also made a note to tell the squad to only bring what was necessary, because too much weight could cause them to fall to their deaths and alert the presence of the Sith. Inside the Jedi Temple, one of the Sith troopers was picking up the frequency and alerted his commander that there was someone on the planet trying to communicate. He wasn't sure if the communication was going off-world or not. The commander told the trooper to block all communications going anywhere, as he ran to tell Cyan about it. While Burst and Zan were waiting for Red-Eye and Flame to make their way up the top of the mountain, Burst told Zan that a trooper just ran from the Jedi Temple to tell the Sith Lord something. The moment the news reached Cyan, he whipped his head around and let out a terrible scream. He told the commander to storm the caves and kill all the survivors, before turning around and yelling out to the men marching around to fan out and see if there was anyone else on the planet. The 4 commanders realized that their presence was noticed. Zan told the squad that the 15 men they were ziplining over would now be on guard. They had to do this quickly. The sun was going to be rising very soon. The dark night began to light up, and there were streaks of dark blue making themselves visible to the planet, and so the clones began to run, crouching as they did, picking up pace as Burst got to the edge of the mountain range as he lowered his rifle, attached a cable to it, and silenced his weapon, before shooting a blast that popped out of his rifle across the canyon as it crashed into the side of the mountain, latching on. Zan told Red-Eye to go first. He could make sure everyone got over there safely. Red-Eye hopped onto the zipline as he began to speed across the canyon, flying above the Sith troopers. Zan tapped Flame on the back, pushing him forwards towards the zipline, as he too hopped on. Zan told Burst that he was next. Burst looked at him and asked about him. Zan told him to go, he would be right behind. Burst hopped onto the zipline as it shot him all the way across the canyon. Though Burst lost control towards the end and dropped off the zipline as he crashed down into a tree. The 15 men were alerted to this as they all turned and looked towards the tree area. Burst hit himself as best as he could. His boot was stuck and he was in a very awkward position. Luckily, when he crashed down, he startled a bunch of birds that called Tython home as they all jumped out of the tree, chirping as they did. The men below noted that the birds were likely startled by a predator, and they turned their attention away. Zan held his breath as he got onto the zipline as he followed it down to the other mountain range. About halfway through, the zipline caught and jammed, almost throwing him from the zipline to his death. Luckily, he had a good enough grip to hold on. He looked around and climbed up to the top of the zipline and started to push his way across the canyon to the mountain where his squad was. Burst, during this time, was able to quietly get himself out of the tree and down to his squad mates. By the time he did, Zan was climbing down. The clones quickly moved around the side of the mountain as the sun slowly creeped up. The clones made their way for the side of the building and climbed down. Zan pulled up the holo map and made a readout of where they were supposed to cut. Burst took note of the fact that the Sith had apparently disappeared. Zan told Burst to stay up high and keep a readout on everything. He was to signal them by tapping on his wrist. The commando squad had an alert button. It didn't require a communication device, but Zan told Burst to tap once if he saw the Sith, or tap twice if it seemed like there was a disturbance. Burst nodded his head and climbed up onto the top of the mountain. At the same time, Flame used a torch to open up a hole in the side of the Jedi Temple. The three clones used all their strength to pull the piece of steel out of the temple and place it down gently without making too much noise. The hole was small, but it would only be noticeable within the next 2 hours when the sun finally rose above the temple. They needed to get in and get out as soon as possible. The clones dropped down into a room in the upper half of the Jedi Temple. There were a bunch of chairs gathered around, and at the end was a door. There were very few windows, and most of the chairs had been turned upside down. Zan told Red-Eye to get to the door and open it quietly. They just wanted to breach the door enough to slide through the gap, not fully open it. Red-Eye got onto it. As he did, Zan and Flame looked at the map again, and found the communication room. It was just down the hallway from where they were. It would be worth getting there so that they could open up communications with Burst so he could communicate a little bit more freely. When Red-Eye got the door open, the three clones moved outside. They formed up behind Zan. The commander of the squad led them as they all rounded the corner and ran up the set of stairs and looked down a hallway. The hallway looked empty, but there was nowhere to take cover. Footsteps could be heard though. Flame looked up and identified 20 troopers walking down the steps. Flame knew that they could take them, as did Red-Eye and Zan, but they were under orders to stay quiet. The commandos ran forward and kept as quiet as they could. The marching of the Sith troopers masked their sound as they made their way to the communication room. Zan told Red-Eye to open the door and cut the power to the room, as he turned to Flame and told him to prepare to put his night vision on. Zan instructed the men to use their hands and their vibroblades exclusively. They didn't want to alert anybody to their presence. Red-Eye got onto the control panel, pushing every button he could, severing the power from the room, turning the lights out, though the door wouldn't open. Zan looked over, insinuating that they didn't have time to hold this out. Red-Eye got a little flustered, but the sounds of boots marching down towards them put his mind into a state of terror. If he didn't get this open right now, then the mission would be compromised, and they would be found by the Sith. Flame told Red-Eye to get it right. The first Sith trooper could be seen at the end of the hallway. Flame and Zan lifted their blasters up as Zan told Flame to be steady. The door shot open as Red-Eye stopped it before it could audibly slam into the hinges. Zan pushed Flame and Red-Eye into the room before shutting the door. There were Sith troopers on the inside of the room looking around, trying to figure out how to turn anything back on. They were alerted to the door opening and closing. Zan slammed the panel to make sure that he locked it. Before turning on his night vision, Red-Eye and Flame fanned out across the room. When Zan turned around, there were 2 Sith troopers closing in on his position. They didn't know he was there, but they were going towards the door. Zan saw this mild inconvenience as something he couldn't escape, but he was a commando after all. As he planted a cable onto his weapon and shot it into the ceiling as he lifted up above the 2 Sith troopers just in time. At the same time, Flame wrapped his arm around a Sith trooper's neck before using his vibro blade to silence him. On the other side of the room, Red-Eye used his knife to strike down 2 men, cutting both in the neck, instantly killing them. Though, as he tried to catch both of them, one of them slammed into the ground. The 2 men below Zan heard it and turned around, asking if the others were alright. They heard no response. Zan dropped down, snapping the neck of one of the men before tackling the other and killing him with a quick blow to the neck. Zan called out in a whisper to hide the bodies. There was a ventilation shaft on the near side of the room that they could use. Flame asked about the vent on the far side of the room. Zan told him that it would be an escape route out of the room if they needed it. Zan told Red-Eye to program the computer terminal to not recognize the communication devices. This would allow the Sith to continue to monitor communications on the planet, but they wouldn't specifically pick up on the commando squad's frequency. Red-Eye got to work, as a sound of marching slowly passed by the room. The clones finished hiding the bodies as the communication array was turned back on. The clones quickly ran towards the other vent and left the room looking perfectly clean, with the lights back on and everything. As the clones climbed in, Zan contacted Burst and told him that their communications were online. They could reach each other through their comlinks if they needed to. Burst acknowledged and then reported that it seemed as if there was a disturbance. There were Sith troopers abandoning their positions. Zan wondered what it could be, but then the sound of an explosion rocked the Jedi Temple. Zan reported to Burst that they didn't know what that was. Then the sound of clones calling out orders could be heard. Zan told the men to take advantage of this moment. They looked around and dropped out of the ceiling down onto another level below. They moved into the corner of the hallways as the sound of a lightsaber ignited. Zan looked down both hallways. Down one side was a group of 40 or so men that came running down. Zan looked at Flame and told him to do what he does best. Flame smiled, and from within his helmet, as he called out Formation 391, he ran over to the side of the wall and threw a thermal detonator. The Sith troopers all looked up when they saw the clone commandos. They were a little confused until the thermal detonator exploded at their feet, sending nearly 20 men across the room in shambles. The clones opened fire. Zan kept an eye on their six as the two commandos cut down the Sith troopers. Zan called out to the men. They were being surrounded. The 20 men that were marching around earlier came barreling down around the corner. Zan shot the first shot, bullseye, as it passed through two of the Sith troopers' heads. Red-Eye and Flame turned around after the smoke cleared, and the last of the Sith troopers were downed. The two commandos moved from side to side to adjust to the blaster fire opening up upon them. The clones put down the 20 men without suffering a casualty or even a hit. Zan called up to Burst and told him to begin firing on the Sith troopers. Burst took the order in and aimed towards the 15 guards. Red-Eye asked Zan why they were going all in on this. Zan told them that there were clones still alive, they could save their brothers, then cutting off reinforcements would be the best way to do it. The commandos ran to the stairs in front of them as they looked down. It was empty, but the sound of blaster fire in the distance riddled across the hallways as it echoed. Red-Eye suggested that the blaster fire might be coming from the caverns below the temple. Zan nodded his head as it began to run down towards the stairs. From above, blaster fire came raining down, and then, below, a good 15 men started firing at the commandos. Zan pushed Red-Eye and Flame down behind the railing as he was clipped in the chest and sent back into the wall. Red-Eye looked over and saw that Zan was heavily damaged. He told Flame to give him cover fire as he jumped over to his squad leader and shoved some back into his veins. Zan tried to get Red-Eye to get the cover, but to him, his brother mattered more. Flame attached the grenade launcher to his rifle as he shot at the staircase above where the Sith troopers were. The stairs crumbled out from below the troopers as they fell down to the ground, along with hundreds of pounds of debris, as they toppled down on top of the Sith troopers on the bottom level that were shooting up at them. With the backlash starting to kick in Zan, he thanked his men. Before they could do anything else though, Burst sent in a communication to them. There were about 200 soldiers emerging from the forest. Burst told them that he was going to take cover. It turns out him sniping the men on the ground alerted them to his presence. They were all hidden in the trees at a very far away campsite, which would explain why the clones never saw them when they scouted the area. Zan told Burst to prepare to get into contact in case they needed to evac. Burst took his orders as he moved away from the face of the mountain to get into cover. Inside the Jedi Temple, the sounds of blaster fire were getting closer. The clone commandos looked over the balcony. When they looked down, they saw 5 clones running away. None of them were Captain Keeley, but they were all panicked. They killed the Sith troopers, and then behind them was the Sith Lord. They cried out, shooting behind them as Cyan knocked the blaster bolt away from himself as he swung towards them, missing. Then Cyan was shot in the side by Red-Eye. Cyan stopped in his tracks as he turned his attention towards the clones on the stairs. He screamed angrily as he looked at the clones. Flame called out Red-Eye for pissing off ugly before Zan told him to run up the stairs. The clones started running as Cyan lunged across the room, slamming through the railing and cutting up the stairs behind the clones. Flame asked why they were going up, as Zan told them to use escape code 14. Red-Eye acknowledged this as he placed a cable on his rifle, as did Flame. The 3 clones kept on climbing as Cyan lunged up the stairs after stair, trying to kill the clones. Red-Eye and Flame prepared as they got to the top where the stairs were missing and jumped off. Zan was right behind them until Cyan jumped up and slammed down on his back, and though he grabbed him, he missed with his lightsaber. Zan looked up, seeing the ugly face of Cyan before making sure that his men got down. Zan threw a punch into Cyan's jaw, pissing off the Sith Lord even more. As the Sith Lord raised his lightsaber up, the clones on the ground began shooting their blaster fire, clipping Cyan's weapon, throwing it from his hands, as Zan kicked Cyan in the stomach before climbing up the stairs and jumping down. Zan snapped his cable on at the last second while falling, shooting it into the stairs and swinging to the ground. He looked at his squad mates and gestured for them to follow him. He asked where the regs were. The others didn't know as they followed him. Cyan leapt down and slammed onto the ground, creating a shockwave that threw the commandos from their feet. The clones flew into a wall and then heard one of their brothers call out to them, telling them to get to them now. Cyan whipped his lightsaber down the hallway as the clones ducked. The lightsaber barely missed as the commandos got up and started running towards the clone trooper that called to them. He was inside the caverns, and he directed the clone commandos forward into a small hole in the cave. It led to an abandoned training room. Zan told the men to shoot the ceiling, and as they did, it collapsed just before Cyan got to them. The 5 clones that were saved by the commandos in the initial hallway continued running out of the temple as they were met with a blaster fire of 200 Sith troopers. The blaster fire cut through them and killed them instantly, before they could even defend themselves. The commandos looked around. They didn't acknowledge the clones in their midst, because with this tunnel sealed, they would run out of air. or the Sith would get to them before they went anywhere. Zan contacted Burst and told them to get in contact with the clone commanders of the Jedi and informed them of the predicament. Burst took the orders in and reached out for Commander Cody as fast as he could. When the commandos realized they were trapped, they looked over. 15 of the 600 men stationed here had survived, and luckily, one of those survivors was Captain Keeley. Our episode continues inside of the Republic High Command. Commander Cody and Mace Windu stood on different sides of the galaxy looking at a hologram of a clone commando. Burst was talking into it. He told them that they had made an engagement with the enemy. Commander Cody was very noticeably disappointed and even slightly annoyed at this, especially after he gave them the specific order to make sure they didn't engage with the enemy. Burst continued by saying that there were survivors. He didn't know how many, but they started a firefight. Burst explained that he was stationed outside the temple to keep an eye on all the things going on, but a battle began inside the temple. He had confirmed that the clones came into contact with the Sith. There was only one present. There was about 200 Sith troopers on the steps of the temple, and he was unsure of how many were alive elsewhere. Burst mentioned that his squad survived, but they were trapped below the temple in an abandoned training room. They were currently trapped in there and they needed an escape route. Mace Windu called upon a newer member of the High Council, Jedi Master Tak Vizsla. He was a Weequay, and he was promoted to the High Council not long after the loss at Coruscant. Master Windu asked if Master Vizsla knew of a way out of the training room. Master Vizsla informed the clone trooper on the communication device that every single training room from the era of the Old Republic was equipped with a lever under one of the various lamps in the room. If the clones could trigger it, it would open up a hole in the floor for them to escape to. From there, their path would take them to the far side of the mountain range, and it would allow them to get out safely. Master Vizsla suggested that once the clone commando gave the information to his brothers, that he make his way to the far side of the mountains to meet up with them. The chances are the exit would have been blasted open because of how old it was, so Master Vizsla told the clone trooper to be careful when his brothers were escaping. Master Windu asked if Captain Keeley had survived. Burst nodded his head. Windu told Master Vizsla to take 2 Jedi with him to Tython. Vizsla nodded his head and bowed before leaving. Burst asked what the reinforcements were. Windu told him that if there were a Sith Lord, he needed to be dealt with and be taken down. Master Vizsla descended the mountain as the call behind him came to an end. When he got to the bottom of the mountain, he was looking for Jedi Masters, but he couldn't find any. Most of all the Jedi Masters had begun deployment, though in front of him were 2 Jedi Knights. Master Vizsla thought for a moment. He looked around and then decided that this would have to suffice. He asked the 2 Jedi Knights if they would like to accompany him to the planet of Tython. One of them asked if they were permitted to go. Vizsla explained that if he was asking, then they were allowed to come. The 2 of them looked at each other and nodded. They asked what they were going to do, as Vizsla explained that they were partaking in a rescue mission. The 2 Jedi Knights were on board as they followed Master Vizsla to the Jedi shuttle and prepared for liftoff. Vizsla would inform them that there was a chance they would have to fight a Sith Lord while they were there, though they were encouraged not to engage the Sith Lord alone if they got separated. The challenge would be staying together, and the most important leg of the mission was to help the clones get off the planet alive. One of the Knights asked if there were Sith troopers on the planet, to which the Jedi Master explained that there were around at least 200, but the rest was unknown. Back on Tython, Burst ended his communication with Zan after informing him of how they could escape the training room. The sound of a lightsaber striking at rocks terrified the clones as they began pulling on the lanterns across the room. One of the Regs asked why the Jedi would do this in their own rooms. Red-Eye, who was always filled with the appropriate answer, suggested that the reason the Jedi did this was because of the guy that was trying to break down the wall and kill them. The Reg shut his mouth. Sure, that was a bit rude, but it was the truth. The chances are the Jedi installed these escape doors in case the Sith invaded their home world. It provided younglings a means of escaping and prolonging the legacy of the Jedi if all were killed. Regardless, Captain Keeley pulled a lever and the clones began piling into the hole. Zan asked Red-Eye if he could get another injection of Bacta. His battle wound was killing him. He was very fortunate to be wearing clone commando armor because if he wasn't, he would have been dead. It was a miracle that he wasn't dead by now, but the way the shot hit him, it was how he survived. The shot smacked him with intense velocity, but the shot came from below. If it had come from above or straight across, it would have entirely killed him. Red-Eye shoved the Bacta into Zan's elbow, and then the 2 commandos jumped down, sealing up the hole behind them, pulling the lever on the bottom. The 15 clones and 3 commandos made their way through the tunnels, the clones in front using their lights attached to the end of their blasters. On the other hand, Cyan blasted through the door as he looked around searching for signs of clone troopers. They just simply vanished. Cyan raged, screaming at the top of his lungs as he whipped around and threw his lightsaber through a line of 10 of his men that had fallen him in, and then used his lightsaber to cut the room to pieces. The clones could hear the echo of Cyan's scream as they started running down the hallway faster. Captain Keeley turned his head around as he realized something. He told the commandos that he left the data chip inside the Jedi Council chambers. Zan looked at Red-Eye, asking if it was the room that they came in. Red-Eye nodded his head, explaining that it was probably the reason why the room was locked up. Zan told Keeley, Red-Eye, and Flame to come with him, as they diverged away from the main path. Zan told the clones to get to safety and close the path behind them to make sure that the Sith couldn't follow them. Burst would meet up with them at the checkpoint, and then he would stay with them until they were on their own and safe. Burst was aware that the Jedi were on their way, but he was really unsure of what their purpose of being here would do, or serve as reinforcements. Zan, as he was running along the corridors and up a small ramp, he contacted Burst and told him that they were going to get the chip that Captain Keeley left inside the Jedi Temple. They would be at the rendezvous point as soon as possible. Burst told Zan that if any Jedi arrived, he would let them know where they were. Zan thanked them before turning off his communication device. Down the hallway, the rigs closed off another exit, and another exit after exit. The tunnels were built to shield the younglings in case of an attack, and so the walls that closed up behind the clones looked like dead ends. So if someone were chasing them through the muddy terrain, it looked like the tracks ended, so the Sith wouldn't have any way to get to them. Of course they could cut down the wall, but that would delay them from getting to the younglings faster, giving them enough time for this escape route. Burst was stationed near the landing craft his squad came down on, as he saw the Jedi starfighter make a quiet landing. Burst looked around and saw the majority of the Sith army had gone missing. He knew that the two Wanderers were inside the temple, but if there were more, they were nowhere to be found. Burst made his way down the mountain as he greeted Jedi Master Visray and the two Jedi Knights with him. Master Visray introduced Natabre Morden and Anakin Skywalker. The two Jedi Knights had become friends in the span of a couple days, though they hadn't yet developed a tight-knit bond, one that would be so frequent amongst the ranks of the Jedi. Master Visray asked the clone commando where the clones were. Burst told him that the clone commandos and Captain Keeley were running back into the Jedi Temple to retrieve the data chip. The rest of the clone troopers were making their way out of the temple. Visray told Burst to set a trap, to which Burst asked why. The Jedi Master looked towards the West Wing and told him to set a trap there, with any of the explosives that they had. Burst thought back to when they left Kamino with his brothers, and then he remembered that Flame had a bunch of explosives inside the ship. Burst took the orders as he prepared the trap. Visray told the clone commando that they would be heading towards the Jedi Temple to make sure that every single clone got out alive. Anakin and Natabre followed Visray as he jumped up and began to scale the mountain. When the Jedi got to the top, Visray turned to the two Jedi Knights and told them that the clones were living beings and should be respected and treated as such. This was their lesson. They were going to save as many lives as they could today. Anakin and Natabre nodded their heads in unison, saying yes, Master. Below the Jedi Temple, Cyan ripped apart the room before discovering the tunnels beneath the Jedi Temple. Cyan told the men to follow him as 100 men piled into the tunnels. Cyan followed the trails of footsteps to a wall as he realized the wall was covered. Cyan reached back and used the Force as he shattered the wall with a Force push. Cyan saw the footsteps as he told his men to follow it. As he looked and followed a trail of 4 different footsteps that led back into the Jedi Temple. Cyan started running after the footsteps that he followed up to the temple, while at the same time alerting the 100 men inside the Jedi Temple that there were clones making their way for the temple. The clone commandos and Captain Keeley got into the training room that was inside the Jedi Temple itself, as they pulled a lever and opened it up. Zan would lift it up first, being that he was in no condition to be pushing up people. Zan helped Red-Eye, Keeley, and Flame up as they closed the latch below them. The clones moved towards the doors that creaked open. There were 100 troopers in here, but they were all separated. Zan told his squad that they'd be acting on Command Order 335. Keeley looked over at him, as Zan told him that 3 was for how many commandos there were, 35 was for stealth, execution, and performance. Keeley nodded his head. As a clone, he understood what direction he was going to be going in during this mission, as he put both of his blaster pistols away. Zan reached onto his boot and pulled out a vibroblade. It was much larger than the vibro knife inside the wrist, but the reason Zan never used it was because it was too unbalanced. It didn't have the same swiftiness of a regular knife, especially since the knife was inside of his wrist. Zan gave the blade to Keeley, Keeley took the blade and followed the clones out of the room as the commandos started running down the hallway. Red-Eye reminded Zan that the staircase had been blown up. They had to make sure they got to the Jedi Council chambers without alerting too many Sith troopers. Flame suggested that there had to be another way to get up there. Flame told Red-Eye that there wasn't anything on the holomap, before Red-Eye reminded Flame that there was also nothing on the holomap about hidden Jedi passageways below the training rooms. Flame agreed, instead of putting up a fight as the clones tried to figure out where they were. Keeley pointed in the right direction, suggesting that the clones follow that path forward. The clones would have to run through the archive room, out past the clerk's desk, towards the grand hall where the large staircase sat. Zan took lead as he crouched down, following what Keeley said, though as they moved forward there was a group of 4 soldiers. The clones quickly got to work, but cutting them down, moving quickly and then continuing to move. Keeley was a clone captain. He certainly could keep up with these clone commandos, but it was challenging. Captain Keeley watched as Zan pulled forward, cutting down 2 more soldiers. His men behind him did the same to 4 more men. Captain Keeley then realized that there was a reason he was a captain and not a commando. The 3 commandos continued moving forward, cutting down more men in their path. The way they saw it, if they discovered, the less trouble they would have. Though they were slowing down their pace as the Sith Lord approached behind them, gaining speed as he got to the underground of the training room. Sion used the Force and shot as much power up as he could, as the floor ruptured and Sith troopers were alerted to the sound of the loud crash coming from the training room. Flame, Red-Eye, Keeley, and Zan took cover as dozens of troopers ran past them. The clones saw their opportunity and ran for it. As they did, they heard Sion ignite his lightsaber, yelling at his men for coming towards him instead of stopping the clones. A couple of Sith troopers were cut down as the clones ran forward. Keeley gave Zan his blade back, as the clones turned to using their blasters instead of knives. The clones shot down several soldiers before they heard the sound of the lightsaber in front of them. They thought it was the end for them, and then they saw 3 lightsabers. It was a Jedi. They had just killed a couple of Sith troopers. Master Vizsla asked the clones where they were going. Zan told the Jedi Master they were trying to get to the Council chambers, but before Vizsla could respond, he pushed the clones out of the way with the Force as he moved in between them, and a lightsaber throw made by Sion. The clones turned around as Anakin and Nandatabre looked at the ugly beast. Sion pointed forward with his lightsaber as he caught it, as the rest of his men that were left inside the temple began to open fire. The clones immediately reciprocated by shooting at the soldiers. Master Vizsla told them to move up the stairs. They would have an advantage by using the railing and having higher ground over the enemy. Skywalker pushed the clones up the stairs as he followed Tabre up, and Vizsla followed him up. The Jedi continued deflecting blaster strikes as more and more Sith troopers fell to the ground. Master Vizsla looked at Sion and told the men to get the chip and get out of here. He would buy them as much time as he could. Anakin looked at Tak and told him he'd stay with Master, before Master Vizsla stopped him and told him to go as he continued walking down the stairs. Anakin felt a tug on his arm. Natabre told him they needed to follow the mission. Anakin nodded his head as he and the clones ran up the stairs. Zan told the men to prepare for ascension cables. Natabre told them that they wouldn't need them. The clones turned around, and when they got to the top of the stairs, confusedly, Natabre told the men to hold on. She lifted her hands and picked up Zan and Red-Eye as she moved the 2 clones to the uppermost half of the stairwell. Anakin did the same for Keeley and Flame, and the 2 Jedi jumped up, following the men up towards the council chambers. Outside of the mountain range, 14 Regs emerged from the ground, as Burst told them to take covering positions. Burst also handed out as many of the heavier weapons as he could, rocket launchers, rotary cannons, what you name it. Burst told them that there was an enemy of nearly 400 men making their way over here. The clones asked how he expected to take them on. There was only 15 clones in total, including the commando. Burst told them that he laid a trap for them. He would bring them into the trap and expose them, but the clones needed to be ready for one last fight. The clones who emerged from the tunnels were exhausted. Their last several hours had been hell. They lost their entire battalion, most if not all of their squad mates. It was atrocious for them. They finally felt like they had survived, only just so they could be thrusted back into more combat. It was a daunting task, 15 versus 400, but Burst told them that they could do it. They just needed to give their all. Burst believed that with the amount of explosives he set, he could easily take out 200 to 300 soldiers. It was just a matter of surviving the last 100. Burst directed the men to get to a higher location. Most of the setup positioned the clones on the mountain with enough cover to protect themselves and enough room to escape if they needed to. The setup took some time, but when they were ready, it was ready. Burst laid down and set his scope out, as he laid the first shot into the head of a Sith trooper marching their direction. Burst was so good from distance that his shot plowed through the first trooper into the trooper trooper behind him. Burst told the clones that the rest of them were now coming this way. See, Burst, being a commando, knew how to lay a trap for Sith troopers. He wasn't just going to booby-trap the ground. Instead, he laid a couple of explosives on the mountain so that it would crumble down on the Sith and cover them. The Sith troopers picked up pace as they continued to run closer and closer into the trap laid by the clone commando. Burst shot round after round, clipping and hitting targets with each shot as they got closer. Some of the Sith troopers started shooting back, but by the time they got into range, Burst clicked the ignition switch. The ground opened up under them as a massive boulder came crashing down. The Sith troopers didn't see it coming, because as the smoke rolled up into their faces, the clones all rose from their crouched positions and began to open fire. This took total advantage in numbers away from the Sith troopers, as they blasted down and crushed through the lines of the Sith. Burst noted that the boulders were able to successfully wipe out several of the troopers present. The blaster fire from the clones put the Sith troopers into chaos. The few that survived the trap emerged from the smoke and then were blasted down. The clone with his hand on the rotary blaster ripped through the Sith. While yes, the Sith were firing back, it didn't do them all that much justice, as they would like. The clones were in higher positions, and it offered them an advantage. The Sith troopers just didn't realize the clones had the high ground. Though, as the smoke cleared, it was obvious there were more than 100 survivors. Burst started pushing men in a direction away from the Sith. He told them that they need to loop back around to the Jedi Temple. The clones at this point were about to embrace their deaths, but they listened. Burst called over to Zan. At the moment, Keeley had gotten a hold of the disc, and Zan took the call. Burst told them that they were in need of reinforcements. There were about 200 Sith troopers chasing them around the forest. Zan looked to his left, and then ordered Red Eye and Flame to ignite Demolition Code 19. The two clones told Keeley to follow them, as they hopped out of the small hole inside the Jedi Council room. Zan looked back. Anakin was looking at the door. He looked back and told the commandos to go save their brothers. He was going to help Master Vizsla. Natabre told Anakin not to, but he told her that it was his responsibility to help. Natabre told him that she was coming too, as the two Jedi jumped off the stairs as Zan watched them leave his visibility before he too climbed out of the hole behind him. The commando squad ran up the side of the mountain. Red Eye shot a detonator charge into the other side of the valley, while Flame began laying a trap on this side of the valley. Keeley watched the clone commandos prepare to trap, as the sound of blaster fire and the clones making callouts got closer and closer. There were now 13 clones remaining. They needed to make this count, right here and right now. Inside the Jedi Temple, Anakin slammed down, barely missing Sion, as Sion kicked Anakin in the chest, throwing him off balance. Natabre stood up over Anakin, defending him, before she too was pushed back, tripping over Anakin. Master Vizsla took advantage of this moment as he swung forward at Sion's back, but he was too slow, as Sion ducked under the swing and spun his blade around his hand, cutting through Vizsla's hand before driving his lightsaber through Vizsla's stomach and driving him backwards 10 feet, before kicking him off the lightsaber and bending him over a railing. Sion whipped his head around as Anakin got to his feet, pulling Vizsla's lightsaber with the Force and igniting the second lightsaber and swinging towards Sion with ferocity. Natabre looked at Anakin in awe as he pushed Sion backwards, throwing the Sith Lord off balance, though Sion took advantage of Anakin's advancement. By using his aggression to his disadvantage, Sion grabbed Anakin Skywalker's arm and threw him against the wall as Anakin hit his head and tumbled down to the ground. Natabre got to her feet and called out Sion. The Sith Lord turned around and began to laugh. He stepped forward, raising his blade, and swung forward. Outside the Jedi Temple, the clones made it through the valley as the Sith troopers followed them. Burst cried out for Zan to call the order, as Zan said not yet. A moment later, the Sith troopers were in position. As Zan gave the order, the walls of the mountain began to collapse. The Sith troopers, having survived one trap, wouldn't be lucky enough to survive another. The clones all turned around and began to open up fire. Laying down the fires, the Sith troopers were caught in the rut. Those who weren't immediately killed by the trap were shot dead on sight. Keeley, Zan, Red Eye, and Flame used their higher ground to fire the heaviest shots they had into the Sith lines, pulverizing them immediately. The clones began to cheer as Keeley looked at Zan, telling him that it seemed as if that was the last of the Sith troopers. Inside the temple, Natabre was on her back again. She was crawling backwards as she looked at Sion. Her lightsaber was on the far side of the room, thrown from her hand while dueling with the incredibly powerful duelist. Anakin's eyes opened back up as he looked at Natabre and slowly got to his feet. Anakin was dizzy and his vision was clouded and shaky. Sion could hear Skywalker get to his feet, but he didn't pay attention. Anakin knew what Sion was doing as he ignited his lightsaber and ran forward. Natabre backflipped up to avoid a strike by Sion as she readied herself by pulling her lightsaber towards her. Sion swung violently around as he twisted his body around to cut Skywalker in half. Anakin slid to the ground, sliding beneath Sion's swing while dragging his blade across Sion's waist. Natabre jabbed forward, slamming her blade into Sion's back as Skywalker jumped up and swung around, cutting Sion's head clean off his body. The Sith Lord's body fell to the ground, dead, as a lightsaber sheathed upon impact with the ground. Anakin and Tabre looked at Sion and acknowledged that he was dead, before they ran over to Master Vizsla to see if he was alive. The Weequay Jedi Master tumbled off the railing as he coughed up his last breath. Anakin held Master Vizsla in his lap and told him they would get him help, as Natabre stood over Anakin's shoulder, looking down, preparing to run and get help from the clones. Master Vizsla shook his head as he grabbed Anakin's hand, pulling him closer. The Jedi Master whispered into Anakin's ear, telling him that the secret was patience. The key to being a Jedi was patience. Master Vizsla ended his life telling the Chosen One to trust in the Force. Master Vizsla's grip fell out of his hands as he fell backward, heavier. Anakin lowered Master Vizsla to the ground and looked back up at Natabre. She bowed her head in sadness. Anakin told her that they should bury him at the home of the Jedi. Natabre agreed. The two of them would take Master Vizsla to the burial chambers and lay him to rest, turning on the age-old machine and sending Master Vizsla's body away, passing the Jedi Master onto the living Force, where he would forever remain. Skywalker would take the Jedi Master's lightsaber and give it to Mace Windu upon their return to Ahch-To. Anakin and Tabre would walk side by side outside the Jedi Temple. When they got out, they looked over at the clones, who were all celebrating their victory. Anakin realized in this moment what the Clone War would bring this galaxy. It would bring challenge, loss, tragedy, but also triumph, camaraderie, and serenity. Sure, peace wasn't here yet, but someday it would be. Anakin looked back over at Natabre, who was still walking side by side with him, and then looked back to the survivors. The men all turned around to see the two Jedi instead of three, and the moment of realization all hit them. Their cheers slowed down and they became quiet. Anakin would step forward, addressing the men, telling them that many were lost, but the battle was won. Digging into his own heart, Anakin would continue saying that the only way to carry on would be with the memories of those they served with, holding them up and taking them with the warriors who survived the end. The war may have just begun, but this was a sign that through the most challenging atmosphere, those dedicated to bring balance and peace back to the galaxy would be able to champion themselves as victors. The men all rallied together, realizing that they had all faced the worst of this short war, but they had only not seen the end of it. The men would load up onto the shuttle and prepare to depart back to Ahch-To. All the survivors would be brought to the homeworld of the Jedi so that they could be honored for their service to the galaxy. The commandos would be hailed as heroes of this mission, and for Captain Keeley, he would reveal everything that had been intercepted from Sith communication. When the shuttles landed on Ahch-To, the Jedi would commemorate the sacrifices of the hundreds of clones and the two Jedi who died on Tython serving with their men. The clone commandos would accelerate from rookies to elitism, having survived and claimed victory over the worst the clones had faced thus far. And for Master Vizsla, he would be remembered as a hero who assisted in the death of Lord Sion. When the ceremony was over, Mace Windu told Natabre and Anakin that they were both brave heroes for doing what had to be done, when they were the only ones who could do anything in the face of adversity. Captain Keeley would be brought to the command center on the Temple Island. Anakin, Natabre, Zan, Flame, Burst, and Red Eye were all present. The clone captain plugged in the data disk, as a computer siphoned through all the data, to find the most important piece. The command center was full of top voices across the entire Republic military. They all watched as a hologram popped up. It was Darth Revan, and he was receiving a transmission from a trusted ally of his in Darth Bane. The Dark Lord asked Lord Revan what it was that he was searching for, and if he could be of any assistance in helping him search for it. Lord Revan turned towards Bane and told him that he was searching for the ancient Starforge. It would be in their pathway to true victory in this war. Bane asked if there was any idea of where it could be found, to which Revan said, it was likely in the unknown regions. The transmission cut after that. The Jedi looked around at each other. They all tried to figure out what it meant. What was a Starforge? Master Opa Rancice emerged from the crowd, telling the Jedi that the Starforge was an ancient weapon that harnessed the energy of a star and of the Force to create an unlimited supply of anything for the one who controlled it. The Jedi looked around at each other. Mace Windu stood stern as he directed everyone present, telling them that no matter what the Sith were after, the Jedi would have to find it before they did. The Jedi would have to get to the Starforge and stop the Sith from creating an army that could march across the galaxy and destroy everything. The clone commandos present told Master Windu that his orders were their next directive. Anakin and Natabre stood next to each other, eager to prepare for their next mission too. Meanwhile, across the galaxy on the planet of Tython, the body of Sion began to slowly move back towards itself. The removed pieces of his body connected, and Sion breathed again. He was alive, his death only temporary, but now realizing the importance of allies that he had himself in the Legion of Sith. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of Season 1. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons. You guys are awesome. Benjamin Wells, Tiger Boy, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, Darth Cheesy, Apollo, Madman Studios, Anakin 003, Lemon Knight, Flynn Van Cease, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Well, you know what to do. Smash that like button. Alright, let's do a little review about Season 1. So, I'm really excited about this. I hope you guys enjoyed Season 1. I really tried to do the whole arc thing, the whole Anakin arc. I feel like was completed. Obviously, the whole story for Anakin hasn't been completed, but the Season 1 arc, the purpose of fulfilling that arc for Anakin, was completed. I set up a possible Season 2. It is now up to you guys to make Season 2 happen. I made Season 1, and so if you guys want Season 2, well, you gotta smash that like button and destroy the like button on all these videos, you know what I mean? And I'm gonna release a full cut of Season 1 with the first part of the original video redone. And so that's going to come out so you guys can watch it all in succession. That'll come out at some point. I don't know when it's going to be done, but that'll come out for you guys. And so this is Season 1. Season 1 was a great journey. I'm really proud of it. I'm not going to lie. I'm very happy with it. I would love to do this series. I've talked about this before several times. I've talked about it on Twitch. I've talked about it in Discord. I've talked about it in comment section. I would love to do this series. I would love to make Season 1 18 episodes. I would love to turn these 6 episodes into 12 more episodes and make an awesome Season 1, make it more complete and larger. But that's entirely up to you guys. This was more so an experiment to see if you guys were interested in it. And so if you guys really like it, then we'll do it again. Obviously, right now I'm working on Season 2 of something else, so I wonder what that could be. But I'm working on Season 2 of what comes next, and so that's going to come next, obviously. But yeah, this is this. I hope you all enjoyed it. I mean, I really tried to make each of the arcs feel like they had their own individual weight. Again, I talked about this as being more like a Clone Wars-esque series, where the series is built to be more geared like the Clone Wars, where it's like, you know, you have your own intro, you have your own quote to start off the episode, you have your own arcs that kind of go together. It's more of a TV-like show on YouTube, and you know, I really try and separate myself from the other YouTubers that do these what ifs, and I always do that because I want to make the best content for you guys, and I really hope that the Season 1 could achieve that. Obviously, there's so much in the room for doing a Season 2, Season 3, even, you know, extending Season 1 to as many episodes. I mean, I really would love to do multiple episodes, multiple arcs, all that stuff, and really continue this story. Again, that just is up to you guys. The reason I wanted to do this miniseries because I wanted you guys to have a very unique experience here on PPSW, where you guys can enjoy, like watching a TV show with your friends, right? You get to enjoy this unique aspect of the Star Wars community where we're all sitting here enjoying, you know, a story and excited to see where the story goes next. I would love to see where the story goes next. Again, it's up to you guys to see if that happens. As of right now, my main focus is Season 2 of what comes next, and that's going to be, you know, the Earth series that's coming next. And right now, well, I'm not going to say anything. You know, I gotta leave it up for you guys. Anyways, I love you all. I hope you all enjoyed Season 1. Spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.